The river road was dying. 3,000 people moved along the trident southern bank in a column that had stopped resembling anything military an hour ago. Carts overturned. A woman in mud-soaked wool held an infant above her head as the crowd surged around her, and no one stopped because stopping meant being crushed. Ahead, the stone bridge at the river crossing was already choked soldiers in mismatched Lannister livery, shoving refugees back with spear hafts, clearing space for a supply wagon that had not moved in 20 minutes. Behind the column, the dead were walking. They came from the tree line on the eastern slope, 40 or 50 of them, moving with that particular wrongness that living things never moved. Joints bending too far, heads tilted past any natural angle, feet dragging at the end of each lurching stride. The soldiers at the rear saw them and did what soldiers did when they had no good options. They formed a ragged line and shouted at each other. Then the sky cracked open. No lightning preceded it. No thunder. Just a sound like the air being torn apart sideways, a pressure drop that made every horse within half a mile shy and scream. And then something fell from directly above, not tumbling, not out of control, but descending at speed with deliberate force, trailing 2 columns of blue-white fire from its feet that turned the river's surface below into a second burning sky. It hit the road between the column and the dead. The impact crater was shallow, maybe 8 inches, and the thing that stood in it was the size of a large man, but built nothing like one. Red and gold, every surface catching the light from a farmhouse burning 300 yards east. No face, just a smooth mask with 2 points of white luminescence where eyes should have been. It stood motionless for 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds, every living person within sight stopped moving. A woman near the front of the crowd made the sign of the 7 without seeming to know she was doing it. A soldier 3 rows back stumbled away from the press, whispering something about the stranger. 2 children buried their faces against their mother's side. The dead did not stop. They never stopped. The first one reached the red and gold figure and swung a rotting arm at it. The repulsor blast took it in the chest and scattered it across 15 feet of road. Inside the suit, Tony Stark was already 3 problems ahead. The AI layer that should have been talking to him. Friday's voice, her constant data feed and dry commentary was simply absent, replaced by the suit's own base diagnostics running solo. He had registered the silence the moment he hit atmosphere. No signal handshake, no network ping, nothing on any frequency. Just the suit, just him and whatever this place was. He had felt something very close to vertigo at that recognition. And then he had looked down at 3,000 people running from the Walking Dead and let the vertigo wait its turn. The onboard sensors gave him what they could. Medieval infrastructure, no gunpowder residue in the air, no electronic signatures anywhere in the scan radius, 47, hostile thermal contacts whose readings matched nothing in any standard threat file. They moved. They had no heartbeat. They had been people once. He went to work. The repulsors cleared the left flank in 3 short bursts, not full charge, just enough to scatter and break momentum. He moved through the gap, planting himself between the living and the advancing dead. One shambler with half its face missing reached for him with intact hands. He caught the wrist, felt the wrong quality of it. No muscle tension, no reflex. Just dead weight in motion, and dropped it with a strike to the base of the skull. The bone gave in a way that told him everything, whatever force was animating these bodies, it wasn't doing it efficiently. The bridge was the real problem. He clocked it in 3 seconds, civilians bottlenecked with no exit. Lannister soldiers about to break from the rear, and a second cluster of corpses wading through the east bank shallows toward the bridge supports. If that group reached the underside while the crossing was packed, the stampede would do half the killing before the dead touched anyone. He lit the thrusters and went up. 30 feet above the river, chaos resolved into geometry. The eastern cluster 22, moving in no real formation, just the natural spread of things that didn't coordinate. He picked the two nearest the supports and hit them with low-yield blasts, then came in fast and low along the water, using the repulsor wake to roll a wave into the group's flanks. Several went under. They did not surface. He banked back toward the bridge without sentiment. The crossing itself was worse. He couldn't run a repulsor sweep through a crowd of panicking civilians. He dropped straight into the center of the bridge, and the crowd did the useful thing. Everyone shoved away from him, opening a ring of empty space out of pure animal fear. He used it immediately, moving toward the Lannister soldiers, blocking the far end and placing himself between them and the oncoming dead. 2 of them bolted the moment he turned their direction. 8 held. "You 8, he said. "Spread across the railing. Keep the line moving. Anyone goes down, you pull them up." Not a request. The kind of tone that didn't leave room for a second read. They moved. He turned and drove a half-charged unibeam into the front rank of dead that had reached the bridge entrance, and the 8 soldiers, terrified, trained out of every other option, held the line behind the burning thing that had fallen from the sky. 11 minutes. He tracked it because that was how he operated, and because 11 minutes was long enough to count what he couldn't reach in time. 31 dead on the eastern bank. He ended 27 before the river current claimed the last 4. 4 civilians died in the crush before the column found its order. An old man's cart horse wouldn't move, and the surge took him under. A child went over the railing on the east side. Tony was 20 feet in the wrong direction, and the trident was fast and dark and did not give anything back. He stood on the north bank when the last civilian crossed and said nothing for a moment. The bridge held. The remaining dead on the south bank, without a stationary target, had diffused south along the road, with the directionless persistence of things that hunted by something other than sight. He noted the behavioral pattern and stored it alongside everything else accumulating in a very long file labeled, "Figure this out later." One of the 8 soldiers, scarred somewhere in his 40s, gripping his spear as though it were the only solid thing left in existence, approached to within 15 feet and stopped. He had not used the spear once. He opened his mouth, found nothing, tried again. "You're welcome," Tony said first. He kept it even. Not unkind. "What are you?" The man's voice came out, scraped bare. Tony looked back across the river. Scorch marks on the road where the dead had been. The smoldering trees. The complete darkness on every horizon that wasn't a burning farm. The hand-fitted bridge stones, the sword at the man's hip, the total absence in the electromagnetic spectrum of anything that hadn't originated from the suit itself. "That's a long answer," he said. "Short version. I'm not what killed your people, and I'm not what's coming down from the north. Everything else can wait." He turned the sensors east and ran a sweep of the hills. 2 more clusters, neither immediately critical, logged. The larger question, where he was, how the transit had happened, and whether any framework he knew applied to any of this, sat in a queue with no good processing window yet. He crouched over one of the fallen dead and let the suit run a full scan. No cardiac rhythm, no neural electrical activity, tissue damage extensive and days old. This one had been a corpse long before tonight. But the eyes stopped him. Not clouded the way dead eyes went, not hemorrhaged. The irises held a faint blue-white discoloration, visible only in the UV band, something with no match in any biological index the suit carried. Not decomposition chemistry, not disease progression, something else. Something that had located the mechanism between dead and moving and activated it with intention. He stood up. "Okay," he said quietly. "Great. It's not just medieval, it's medieval with zombies." To the north, so distant, his audio filters nearly lost it, Beneath the wind off the river, a raven screamed once sharp, carrying nothing but distance and urgency. Like a message that had already left before anyone had decided to send it. The village of Rushford had a Meister once. He had left 2 years ago when Lannister supply requisitions stripped the place down to seed grain and stubbornness, and nobody had sent a replacement. What Rushford had now was a headman with gout 40 families who hadn't decided whether to run north or south, and a great hall that leaked in 4 places but still held heat if you packed enough bodies into it. Jon Snow had been awake for 31 hours by the time he commandeered it. He didn't think about that number particularly. The North had a way of making sleep feel like something that happened to other people. What he thought about, that was the raven cage in the corner, 2 birds left, one already gone north with a message he wasn't certain would reach anyone in time. And the rough map spread across the table. And the reports that kept arriving in pieces that contradicted each other on almost every point except one. The dead had been destroyed at the Trident Crossing. Burned. By something that moved faster than a horse and hit harder than anything they had a word for. Some witnesses said wings. Some said demon. An old Septon had collapsed, weeping, and refused to elaborate. Jon had listened to all of it and then sent everyone out except Ed, and the 2 of them had stood over the map in the leaking hall, while the fire ate itself down and the cold pressed in through the gaps in the eastern wall. Whatever had come down at the Trident had attacked the dead first. That was the part that mattered. Everything else could wait. He was still marking the map when the door opened and the cold sharpened, and then the thing from the reports walked in behind it, taller than he'd expected. The red and gold plating caught the firelight and doubled at every surface, machined to a smoothness no forge in Westeros had ever produced. The faceplate was featureless, except for 2 points of pale light, where eyes should have been, and those points moved across the room in one slow, complete sweep table map. Exits Jon Ed before settling. Not curiosity, assessment. The difference was audible in the quality of the stillness that followed. Ed took 1 step back and touched his sword hilt without drawing. Smart, Jon thought. Also irrelevant, but smart. Jon Snow. The voice from behind the faceplate carried no question in it. You sent the riders? I did. Jon didn't move from the table. And you cleared the Trident Crossing? Tony Stark. A pause while the figure read him the way Jon was reading it. You came light. 6 riders, no house banners, fast animals. Either you're reckless or you understood that arriving heavy would end this conversation before it started. The second one. The armored figure moved to the table without being invited and looked down at the map. Before Jon could say anything else, it had already traced the fall line of the northern outposts, the last known position of the main force, the distance remaining to Winterfell, and looked up. Less than a breath's worth of time. What do you need? Stark said. Not a question. The inflection of a man who had already moved past whether to help and was waiting for the specifics. I need you to understand what you're dealing with before I ask anything. I scanned one of them at the Trident. I know there's something external running the bodies. Not decomposition chemistry, not muscle memory, something introduced after death. I know it's operating at a scale I haven't seen before, and I know killing individuals without cutting the source off is a long way around a short problem. He glanced up. I understand what you're facing. What do you need? Jon studied him. People who claimed to understand the dead split into 2 groups, those who had seen them from a distance and those who had watched them rise. Stark sounded like neither, which meant he had assessed the problem the way an engineer looked at structural failure, without sentiment, without freezing. Jon didn't know if that was better or worse, but it was useful. I need you at the front, he said. Not held in reserve, not behind walls, where the line breaks. Done. And I need you to stop calling them threat clusters. The faceplate didn't move, but something in the posture around it shifted the small involuntary adjustment of a person catching themselves mid-assumption. What do you call them? The dead. Our dead. People who had names. John held his gaze on the pale eye points. The men who fight beside me buried some of them. That matters here. The silence that followed was different from the others. Shorter, more considered. Noted, Stark said. And meant it. The hall door opened a second time. The cold came in again, and with it Tyrion Lannister wrapped in a traveling cloak, 2 sizes too large, attended by a single guard who had the look of a man who had run the last quarter mile and was working hard not to show it. Tyrion stopped just inside the threshold and took in the full picture, the map. Jon, the armored figure, the gap in the eastern wall, the 2 birds left in the raven cage. He did not reach for a weapon or step backward. He tilted his head instead, the precise, almost bird-like motion of a man rapidly revising 4 hours of calculations into something workable. Well, Tyrion said, descriptions have a habit of underselling the genuinely unprecedented. He crossed to the table without waiting for an invitation and poured wine from the jug near Jon's elbow as though he lived there. Tyrion Lannister, my queen has dragons and army, and a strong preference for not having the dead consume the continent she intends to rule. You are Tony Stark, and you have whatever that is. A gesture at the suit economical and precise. And a demonstrated willingness to engage things that send everyone else running. I have a proposal. I've had proposals, Stark said. They tend to come with terms I find out about after I've already committed. All proposals have conditions. The honest kind state them first. Tyrion settled into a chair with the ease of a small man who had spent his life at tables he wasn't supposed to occupy. My queen wants the dead stopped. She also wants the Iron Throne. I won't pretend those 2 ambitions are cleanly separate. But the second one is worthless without the first. There'll be nothing left to rule. What does she want from me specifically? Help end the Southern War fast. Every army that's currently killing other living people needs to be turned north. Stark looked at him the way he'd looked at the map, short, complete, nothing wasted. And in exchange, resources, information, full cooperation. I don't need resources. Flat, accurate, nothing performative about it. I need 2 things. First, nobody uses my presence to force anyone's submission. I'm not a flag you plant on a hill to make people kneel. If I see someone being pressed into obedience because I'm standing nearby, I'm done. He looked from Tyrion to Jon and back. Second, the dead come first. Every choice, every timetable, every strategic call runs through that filter. Anything that slows the response north gets a no. Tyrion turned his cup slowly. For a moment he said nothing, and Jon could see the actual calculation happening behind his eyes. Not whether the terms were acceptable, but whether Daenerys would accept them and what it would cost to find out she wouldn't. It was the face of a man who had been managing the distance between a good idea and his queen's tolerance for a long time, and was not certain it had gotten any wider recently. Those are workable terms, Tyrion said finally. Not remarkably reasonable. Workable. The word of a man still measuring. And if she disagrees, then she and I will talk directly. No threat in it. Just the settled certainty of someone who had run that scenario and found it untroubling. Tyrion looked at Jon. Jon returned it with the expression he wore when he had already decided and was waiting for the room to finish catching up. The hall shook, one hard impact on the eastern wall. Then a second, and then the perimeter riders were shouting, and Ghost's howl came through the gap's low, sustained furious. Stark was moving before the third blow landed. The suit's eye points intensified, flooding the near end of the hall in cold white light, and he reached the wall gap in 3 strides and scanned the dark beyond it. Jon had Longclaw clear. Edwin was at the door, and for once the look on his face had moved past his usual exhausted resignation into something sharper and older. 11, Stark said. Tree line 30 yards out. 3 already at the wall. Jon assessed his riders, 4 men competent caught flat-footed. The gap was a single-file bottleneck, useful if held, fatal if lost. Hold the gap. Nothing gets through to stack up inside. He went out the main door and came around the eastern wall at a run. 2 of the dead had pushed into the gap. A third dragged itself through on its elbows. His riders had pulled back 10 feet and were stabbing at range, the right call, when you didn't yet know what ended these things and what didn't. He took the nearest one with Longclaw through the neck into the skull. The Valyrian steel did what it always did. The thing dropped and stayed down. The second turned toward him with the blind, absolute persistence that was worse than rage. Rage had limits, and he shoved it back into the gap with his shoulder. Felt his footing go on. The frozen mud went down on one knee with his sword up, and the dead thing pitching forward above him. The repulsor blast came from his left and slightly above, close enough that the heat of it crossed his face like an open door. What had been a dead man came apart. Stark dropped from 10 feet and landed between Jon and the gap. And the 3 riders who had been hesitating found themselves hesitating for entirely different reasons. 8 more. 40 yards moving slow. 90 seconds to the wall. Jon stood. Take them before they reach us. Your men haven't seen this at close range yet. It's going to be loud. Jon turned to his riders. 3 of them were staring at Stark, the way men stared at things they'd heard described, and now understood the descriptions had been inadequate. One had his hand flat against his chest, the 7, Jon thought, or something older. Hold your ground, Jon said. Do not run. He looked at Stark once. Stark looked back. Then he went up. What followed was loud and brief and total. The field east of the hall went dark, and then bright, and then dark again. And when the light died, nothing in it was moving. The riders held. One of them retched quietly against the wall after it was over the kind of sound a man made when his body needed to process something his mind hadn't finished with yet. Another was still whispering the 7 the old gods, something, hands shaking at his sides. They all stayed at their posts. Stark came down. No ceremony. He landed, checked the field with one scan, and walked back inside. Inside, the fire was lower. Tyrion had refilled his cup and was sitting very still. The expression on his face careful and controlled, and not quite successful at concealing what lay under it. He had just watched 11 dead men get removed from the world in the time it took to drink half a cup of wine. He was working out what that meant for every remaining piece on every board he currently managed, and the working out was not going well. 11, he said. Inside a mile of a defended position, south of the Trident. Yes, Jon said. That's past any sighting in the last 2 weeks. He set the cup down. They're moving faster. They're always faster than the last estimate. Jon folded the map and tucked it into his cloak. He looked at Stark. What we just killed, that was a ranging party. Forward scouts for a force that numbers in the tens of thousands. The main body is weeks behind. Maybe less. A pause. I need your answer. Not terms. Yes or no. Stark looked at Jon, then at Tyrion, then back. Your conditions still stand, he said to Tyrion. They stand. Then yes. He turned to Jon. I want everything you have on the commander. Every account, every record, every piece of information anyone has ever written down about what leads them. Age of the source doesn't matter. I don't go into something like this without data. You'll have it by morning, John said. Outside, Ghost had gone silent. The field east of the hall was dark and still, and somewhere far beyond it, past the rivers and the forests and the ruins of the wall, the dead were walking south, more than last week, faster than anyone had modeled for. And at Dragonstone, on its cliff above the sea, a silver-haired woman was reading a raven's message by candlelight. Her lips pressed together in a line that was not quite anger and not quite calculation, but something between the two. She read it twice. She set the parchment down on the table beside her wine and looked at it for a moment, the way she looked at things that had arrived without her permission. The message described a man in red and gold iron who had not knelt to any authority, living or dead, since he had appeared at the Trident Crossing. "Find out everything about him," Daenerys Targaryen said. Her voice was level, controlled. The particular tone she used when something had moved onto the board before she had placed it there herself. "And send word. I will meet him." No one in the room asked what she intended when she did. The village had a name once. Whatever it was, nobody living in it seemed to use it anymore. They called it the Mill Town, or the Crossing, or just down the road, the way people referred to places that had stopped being destinations and become simply where you happened to be when things got bad. Tony had been moving south along the river road for 6 hours when he found it, and found it was the wrong word. You didn't find a place like this. You arrived, and it arrived at you, its specific weight settling over everything, before you fully registered what you were seeing. 200 people, maybe more, pressed against the outside of a grain storage compound. Stone walls, iron-braced gates, a Lannister house sigil carved into the lintel above the main doors. The gates were shut. Inside, by thermal scan, 12 men and enough grain to feed the crowd outside for 3 weeks. Outside in the cold, children in wool, thin enough to see through old men sitting in the mud, because standing had stopped being worth the effort. A woman nursing an infant who had gone quiet in a way that infants didn't go quiet when they were simply sleeping. John rode beside him and said nothing. He had the particular quality of a man who had seen this before and was past the stage of reacting to it as an outrage and into the stage of cataloging it as a fact. "How long have they been here?" Tony said. "Since yesterday, probably. Maybe the day before." John's voice had the flatness of a man reporting weather. "The steward will say he's holding the stores for the garrison. The garrison needs to eat to fight. The fight protects everyone. That's how the logic runs." That's not logic. That's a word problem with a body count built in. John looked at him. Not agreement, not argument, just the look of a man noting the observation. Tony dropped to the road surface and walked to the gate. The crowd parted around him the way crowds parted, not because they wanted to, but because the thing moving through them was red and gold, and gave off the ambient suggestion of something that could level the wall behind them without particular effort. He stopped at the gate and looked up at the 2 guards on the wall walk above. "Open the gate," he said. One of the guards found his voice first. "By whose authority?" "Mine." He looked up at them steadily. "You have 12 men and enough grain in there to feed everyone standing outside this wall for 3 weeks. Some of those people will be dead by morning if the temperature drops 2 more degrees, and it's going to drop 4. Open the gate and start distributing, or I'll open it myself. And you can explain to whoever asks why you didn't." A long pause. The guard looked at his companion. His companion looked at the crowd, then at Tony, then at the armored fists, then back at the grain stores. The gate opened. It was not a victory. Tony understood that clearly as he watched the crowd push through the desperate, shambling press of people who had been cold for days and were now moving toward warmth and food with the focused urgency of those who had learned not to expect either. It was not a victory because the grain stores existed, because they had been locked, because the 12 men inside had watched the crowd accumulate through 2 nights and done the math that this system taught them to do their garrison, their wall, their survival. Everything outside was someone else's equation. He stood by the gate until the last of them were through, and then he walked back to where Jon and Tyrion were waiting. Tyrion had not dismounted. He was watching the crowd filter through the gate with the expression of a man performing rapid calculations about how many of these existed along every road between here and King's Landing. "That steward will send a rider to his lord before nightfall," Tyrion said. "Good," Tony said. "Tell his lord the math changed. The lord will want to know by whose authority." "I already answered that question today." Tyrion looked at him for a moment, then at Jon, then back at the receding crowd. He said nothing further. But his jaw was set in the way of a man storing a problem for later rather than resolving it now. They rode on. So the crows found them 2 hours south, or they found the crows, hard to say which, when the black shapes were wheeling over a farm that had smoke still rising from the east end and bodies arranged in the yard with the careless geometry of things that had been dropped rather than placed. Tony ran the scan before they reached the fence line. 8 dead, all with cause of death, consistent with edged weapons, 4 horses taken, grain stores empty, 3 survivors hiding in the root cellar under the barn. Bandits. Or soldiers. The distinction was narrowing by the hour. Jon dismounted and went to the cellar door. The survivors came up slowly. A man with a gash across his forearm, wrapped in cloth that had gone stiff with old blood, his wife, their daughter, who was perhaps 7, and had the particular stillness of a child who had decided that making noise was dangerous. "Which way did they go?" Jon asked. The man pointed south and east. Jon looked at Tony. Tony was already in the air. He found them 4 miles down a track that cut through open farmland. 9 riders, heavy with grain sacks and bundled cloth, Lannister colors on 3 of them, the rest in no colors at all. They were moving at a walk unhurried because nothing in this world had yet given them reason to hurry. He dropped in front of the lead horse. The horse reared. 2 riders drew weapons. The others pulled up short and stared at the thing that had appeared in the road from empty sky, and the staring had the quality of men encountering a category problem. "The horses," Tony said. "The grain, the cloth. You're going to turn around and bring all of it back." "We're Lannister," the nearest man started. "I know what you are." He looked at the 3 with house colors. "That makes it worse, not better. You're soldiers. You had a choice between protecting those people and stripping them, and you stripped them." He stepped closer. The lead horse shied again, and the rider fought for control. "Turn around. Bring it back. If I have to ask a second time, the asking is going to be a lot less conversational." They turned around. He walked behind them the entire 4 miles back, which was not strictly necessary. They were not going to run, but which had the useful effect of ensuring they arrived in the farmyard in a way that felt like an accounting. The farmer watched them unload with the flat, careful expression of a man who had been wronged so many times he had learned to receive redress with suspicion rather than relief. Jon was still there when they returned. He watched the unloading without comment. When the 9 riders had gone, he looked at Tony with something that wasn't gratitude and wasn't surprise. It was closer to the look of a man who had just seen proof of a theory he had long held but had never expected to test in a single afternoon. "That happens every day," Jon said. "On every road." "I know. You can't be on every road." "I know that too." Tony looked at the farmhouse. The smoke from the east end had thinned, but the smell of it sat in the air, heavy and specific. The little girl was standing in the doorway watching the riders leave, and the expression on her face was the expression of someone who had learned the world's rules and did not find them acceptable, but had not yet decided what to do with that. He recognized it. He'd worn it himself for a few years in his late 20s before he'd done something about it and then caused a different set of problems. It doesn't mean you stop. John said nothing to that, which was Tony was beginning to understand John's particular form of agreement. The third thing they found was worse than either of the first two because it had already finished. A village of perhaps 60 houses, half a day's ride east of the road, tucked into a bend of a small tributary. They came to it following a report from one of John's outriders dead in the street, but not the walking kind. The walking kind had come through 2 nights ago, a small pack 8 or 10. The village had a wall of sharpened stakes and a plan, and they had executed both. 6 of the whites were still pinned to the stakes, desiccated in the way dead things went in the cold. The village had also lost 11 people to the attack. 6 had died fighting. 5 had died afterward in the night from cold because the fire that had been used to stop the whites had taken 2 buildings with it, and nobody had the materials to rebuild before the temperature dropped. 49 survivors. Clean water. No food stores. The whites had been in the granary before the villagers reached it. A week to the nearest resupply point, assuming the road stayed clear. Tony found the elder, a woman in her 60s, with soot still in her hair, and the hands of someone who had been digging all day. "How long until you run out of what you have?" he said. 4 days, she said. "Maybe 5 if we're careful." He looked at the village. 49 people, 11 dead, a wall of stakes that had worked, and a granary that hadn't. "There's a Lannister supply post 11 miles south," Tyrion said, coming up behind them. "I can write a requisition." "That takes 3 days to process, even in normal circumstances," Tony said. "Yes." "And these aren't normal circumstances?" "No." Tony looked at Tyrion for a moment. Tyrion returned the look with the expression of a man who knew exactly what was about to happen and was working out the downstream costs, not whether it was right. That wasn't the calculation. The calculation was which lord would object, how loud, and how much goodwill it would cost to smooth over. This was Tony was coming to understand how Tyrion thought about almost everything. And it was not wrong exactly. It was the kind of thinking that kept large systems from collapsing all at once. It was also the kind of thinking that had produced the locked gates this morning and the burning farmhouse this afternoon. "Write the requisition," Tony said. "I'll get the food now. Sort out the paperwork after." Tyrion wrote the requisition. Tony went to the supply post, presented the letter to the officer in charge, and when the officer explained that the letter needed countersigning by a lord of the applicable territory before any stores could be released, Tony looked at him for a long moment and then said very quietly, "I am going to explain this one time. There are 49 people 11 miles north of here who will start dying in 4 days. Your paperwork takes 3. Those 2 numbers do not work together. Release the stores." The stores were released. He carried them back himself, which was faster than a cart, and had the additional effect of making the supply run visible, the red and gold figures setting down sacks of grain in the village square. While the survivors watched with the particular silence of people who had stopped expecting anything and were recalibrating. The elder stood in the doorway of what had been the granary and watched him unload and said nothing until he was finished. Then she said, "Who are you?" He considered several answers. "Someone who noticed," he said. She looked at him the way old people looked at things they had lived long enough to know were temporary. Not unkind. "Just honest. They'll lock the post again tomorrow," she said. "And the day after. And next week there'll be another village." "I know." "Then what does this fix?" He didn't answer, not because he didn't have one, but because the honest answer was not enough. Not by a long distance. He had saved 49 people from 1 week's starvation in a world where the mechanism that produced starvation was operating on every road, in every district, under the banner of every house that was currently more interested in who held the Iron Throne than in whether the people underneath the throne were still alive. He flew back in the dark, and the dark over Westeros was very complete. No electric light on any horizon. Nothing but fire from farmhouses and torches and the occasional burning farmstead, orange smears in the black. From up here, the scope of it was visible in a way it wasn't from the ground, the long dark of a continent where the infrastructure of survival had been systematically dismantled to feed a war that most of the people dying in it hadn't chosen. Jon was waiting at the camp they'd made by the road. He had a fire going, small and practical, and he was looking into it the way he looked into most things directly, without softening the view. "The village will be fine for a week," Tony said. "Yes. And then what?" "Then we hope the road north is clear enough to resupply them before the next problem arrives." Jon poked the fire once. "This is what the South calls order." Tony sat down. The suit systems ran their nightly check minor ablative damage on the left forearm from a piece of farmhouse timber energy reserves at 73% nothing structural. Around them the camp was quiet except for the horses and the distant, intermittent sound of owls working the frozen fields. "Daenerys wants to meet," Tyrion said from across the fire. He had been there the whole time, Tony realized, sitting at the edge of the firelight, turning his cup in his hands. "I received a raven this afternoon. She's moving west from Dragonstone inland position. She wants a meeting at a neutral location 3 days' ride from here." Tony looked at the fire. "What does she want from the meeting?" "Formally, to discuss cooperation against the dead and the resolution of the Southern War." Tyrion paused. "Practically, she wants to understand what you are and whether you can be worked with." "Worked with," Tony repeated. "That's one way to say it. It's the diplomatic version. What's the honest version?" Tyrion was quiet for a moment. "She wants to know if you're a threat or a resource. And she wants to make that determination before it becomes relevant." Tony looked into the fire. He thought about the locked gate this morning, the burned farm, the 49 people, and their 4-day supply of grain, the particular expression on the elder's face when she'd said, "What does this fix?" He thought about the supply officer's paperwork and the 3 days it took to process, and the dead who didn't wait 3 days. "Tell her 3 days," he said. "Neutral location. She brings 3 people. I bring Jon." Tyrion glanced at Jon. Jon had not moved. "She won't like the limit on her party size," Tyrion said. "She'll accept it or she won't." Tony lay back against his pack and looked up at the sky, which was clear and moonlit and full of stars that were the same stars regardless of what continent you were standing on. "I've had a full day of people deciding what other people are worth based on what's convenient for them. I'm not starting the next conversation from a position of being impressed by someone's retinue." The fire crackled. Somewhere south, a raven was already flying. The meeting ground was a sept that nobody used anymore, 3 miles off the main road, in a clearing that had the cold, scrubbed feel of a place that had been important once and wasn't anymore. Stone walls, a roof that had lost 2 of its 7-pointed stars to weather a floor of cracked slate that had frost in the joints. Neutral as advertised, also drafty, uncomfortable, and carrying the specific atmosphere of a location chosen to signal that nobody was on home ground. Tony arrived first, which was the point. He had come down from the air, done a full sweep of the tree line. No hidden cavalry, no archers, no secondary force staged a mile out, and was standing in the center of the sept's main chamber when the sound of hooves announced Daenerys Targaryen's party. Jon stood at the far wall with his arms crossed, and Ghost ranging somewhere outside, visible as a pale shape through the empty window frames. Tyrion had arrived 30 minutes prior, ostensibly to prepare the room, actually to read the architecture and the sightlines, and arrive at whatever calculations Tyrion arrived at when left alone with strategic real estate. 3 riders, as agreed. Daenerys herself, Missandei riding close on her left, and a man Tony didn't recognize immediately, heavy-set, watchful, carrying himself with the controlled stillness of someone whose job was to notice things without appearing to. He filed the face for later. Daenerys entered without waiting for the door to be held. She wore dark clothing, leather-armored at the shoulders, her white-silver hair braided back from her face, a field queen's presentation, not a throne room's. She had dressed for a meeting between equals or near equals, Tony registered. Someone had advised her well, or she had arrived at that conclusion herself. Either possibility was interesting. She stopped in the center of the chamber 10 feet from him and looked at him with the direct, measuring gaze of someone who had learned very young that showing uncertainty was a weapon you handed to other people. "Tony Stark," she said. Her voice was even carrying without effort. "I've been told the descriptions don't capture it adequately." "They rarely do," Tony said, going both directions. Something moved in her expression, not quite amusement, not quite its absence. She let the moment sit for a breath, establishing that she controlled the rhythm, then continued. "I wanted to meet you because what you did at the Trident and at Rushford matters. The dead are the enemy that will consume everything if they're not stopped. I have dragons, an army, and the intention of ending the war in the south before the north falls. You have capabilities that nothing in this world can match." She looked at him with absolute steadiness. "I want us to fight toward the same end." "That's a reasonable thing to want," Tony said. "And yet, I understand you've been reluctant to commit to any alignment." "I've been reluctant to commit to any alignment that comes with strings I find out about later." He watched her. She was good composed, purposeful, the kind of presence that filled a room without pushing at it. What does fighting toward the same end look like specifically? Daenerys took one step closer, not aggressive, calibrated. "It means the armies currently killing each other in the south need to stop. Cersei Lannister controls King's Landing, and she will burn it before she surrenders it. Every week she holds the city is a week the North loses ground. I can take the city, but faster, cleaner, with less cost to the people inside it, if the threat from outside the walls is neutralized first." A pause. "That's where you come in. You want me to clear the military infrastructure around King's Landing before your dragons go in. I want us to take the city together, quickly, and then turn everything north." Tyrion had gone very still near the wall, the way he went still when a conversation arrived at a point where the next sentence would determine 3 subsequent moves. Tony turned the proposition over. It wasn't wrong. It was actually fairly sound. Tactically, the faster King's Landing fell, the faster the war in the south ended, the faster the full weight of every surviving army could be directed toward the Night King. He could find no meaningful flaw in the strategic logic, which meant the problem was elsewhere. "And after King's Landing falls," he said, "after the North is handled, what does Westeros look like?" "Unified," Daenerys said, "under a rule that protects its people rather than consuming them. I've seen what the current system produces. I grew up in exile because of it. I don't intend to rebuild it." "That's the intention," Tony said. "I'm asking about the structure. Who decides? Who enforces? Who answers when the system fails the people inside it, and it will fail them, because every system does so. The question is what happens then?" A fractional change in her bearing, something tightening controlled quickly. That's a conversation for after the dead are stopped. It's a conversation for now because the answer tells me what I'm actually agreeing to. He kept his voice level. No edge, no provocation. Just the flat insistence of someone who had built and rebuilt systems and understood that the foundation mattered more than the intention. You want to rebuild Westeros? I've spent 3 days watching what Westeros does to the people at the bottom of it. Locked granaries, burned farms, dead children outside the walls of full storage compounds. That's not Cersei's system specifically. That's the operating logic of the whole structure. The strong decide what the weak deserve and call it order. Daenerys held his gaze. What I intend to build is different. I believe you intend that. He meant it. That was the thing she wasn't performing. The belief was real. The drive behind it was real. The specific quality of someone who had been powerless and was determined never to be powerless again was very real. What I don't know is whether the structure you're building can survive contact with the temptations that come with the seat you're fighting for. Power doesn't usually make people more what they intended to be. The stillness in the room had a texture now, the held breath of people watching something that had not yet broken but was being tested. You speak as though you know something about power, Daenerys said. Her voice was still controlled, but something had moved underneath it. I've had a lot of it. Made significant mistakes with it. Built things to compensate for the mistakes, and then made different mistakes with those. He looked at her directly. That's not an argument against you. It's an argument for building in limitations from the start. Missandei had gone very still. Tyrion was staring at the floor with the focused expression of a man doing arithmetic that wasn't going well. What is it you actually want from this meeting? Daenerys said. The question had a different quality from her earlier ones, less political architecture, more the direct inquiry of someone who had decided to close the distance between positions and find out what was actually in the gap. The same thing you want. The dead stopped. The people in the path of them not dying because some lord decided his grain stores were more important than their lives. Tony shifted his weight slightly, not a step forward, just a redistribution that changed the geometry of the conversation. What I'm not prepared to do is publicly stand behind your claim to rule in exchange for that. Not because I think you're the worst option in this war, you're not, but because the moment I become a symbol of your authority, I've handed you something I can't take back. And I've handed everyone under you a reason to stop thinking about whether the authority is justified. Daenerys looked at him for a long moment. Nobody moved. Outside Ghost made a low sound, not alarm, just presence. You're asking me to accept your help without offering me the recognition that makes that help politically meaningful, she said. I'm asking you to accept that meaningful help and political recognition are two different things. Not in this world, they aren't. Then that might be one of the things wrong with this world. It landed without theatrical weight, which was almost worse. Daenerys looked at him, and Jon looked at the floor, and Tyrion closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, in the manner of a man absorbing a blow he had seen coming and been unable to prevent. The silence held for 5 full seconds. Then Daenerys drew a breath slow and composed, and the composure itself was a kind of answer. She had decided the conversation wasn't over, which meant she had decided erupting wasn't worth the cost. We are not finished here, she said. Not a question. No, Tony said. We're not. She left with the same deliberate lack of ceremony with which she'd arrived, Missandei close behind. The door did not slam. That too was a decision. Nina, Tyrion sat down on the cold slate floor with the slow, careful movement of a man whose legs had decided they were done with standing on ceremony. That went, he said, approximately as well as I feared. Jon came away from the wall. Will she try to force it? Not immediately. She's too disciplined for that. Tyrion turned his cup in his hands, empty, which was a rare condition for it under stress. But she will look at everything he does from here forward through the question of whether it strengthens or weakens her position. And when it weakens it enough times in a row. He stopped. Didn't finish. She'll move, Jon said. She'll consider whether the cost of moving has become lower than the cost of not moving. Tyrion looked at Tony. I want you to understand that I'm not saying she's wrong necessarily. In the world, this is political recognition has consequences. The support you give, without the acknowledgement behind it, is support people can choose to ignore when it's inconvenient. You're asking her to build an army on a foundation that can be argued away. I know what I'm asking, Tony said. I'm not sure you know what it costs her. I know exactly what it costs her. He sat down on a broken section of wall, and for a moment the suit's hum was the only sound in the room. That's not a reason to give her the blank check. Tyrion looked at him for a long time. Then, Varys will have been watching through whatever means Varys watches things. He'll have an opinion. What kind of opinion? The kind that involves rethinking all his current positions simultaneously. Tyrion finally found a reserve of wine in the bottom of his cup that hadn't been there before and drank it. He's been wondering for years whether Daenerys is the right answer or merely the least wrong one. Tonight gave him a new variable to work with. Jon pushed off from the wall. The dead don't care about any of this. No, Tyrion said. They don't. Then we should still be moving north. Jon looked at Tony. Whatever happens between you and her, it needs to happen faster than the army that's coming down. Agreed, Tony said. They left the sept as the last of the daylight pulled out of the sky and the stars came out over Westeros, sharp and cold and indifferent to the calculations being made beneath them. Somewhere a half-mile behind Tony, new Daenerys Targaryen was sitting with Missandei in the dark and saying very little the way people sat with trusted advisors when what had happened was still being converted into what it meant. She had walked into a room expecting to encounter a weapon looking for a hand to hold it. She had found something else entirely, and that was the problem. Not that he was dangerous, she understood. Dangerous had grown up surrounded by, it had become some measure of it herself. The problem was simpler and worse. He had looked at her claim, her lineage, her dragons, and her certainty, and he had not been moved. He had looked at all of it and asked, yes, but is it right? And that question, that particular intolerable question, was one that she had not been asked in a very long time. And she did not yet know what to do with the fact that she didn't have an answer. Cersei Lannister had not slept in 2 days, and she found she did not miss it. Sleep was for people who had run out of problems to solve. She had not run out. She had in fact acquired a new one so large and strange that it had pushed every other problem into a more useful perspective. Because compared to a man in iron who fell from the sky and was apparently indifferent to her authority, Daenerys Targaryen, with her dragons, was merely a known quantity. Dragons, she understood. Dragons could be studied, their approach predicted, their weaknesses mapped. Her father had burned. It was possible under the right conditions to make things burn back. The Iron Man was different. The Iron Man did not operate within any framework she had ever learned to read. She stood at the window of the Tower of the Hand, while Qyburn laid out the progress of his preparations on the table behind her. The city below was moving at the particular density of a place, receiving more people than it was designed to hold, the roads thick with carts and animals, and those who had abandoned both and were simply walking, streaming in through all 4 main gates because she had ordered them open. Her stewards and her counselors had advised against it. Too many mouths, they said. Too many bodies. The granaries cannot sustain it. The garrison will be overwhelmed, managing the influx. She had listened to all of them and then given the order anyway, because her counselors were thinking about logistics, and she was thinking about something else entirely. "The eastern placement is complete," Qyburn said from the table. He spoke in the dry, precise manner of a man reporting measurements. "The granary district, the tannery quarter, 3 sections of the harbor approach. Small caches well distributed. No single source large enough to produce a visible signature from above before ignition. I've also had the trigger mechanism divided. No central switch, no single point of failure. Each cluster operates independently and requires manual activation by a designated person at close range." "How many people?" 11. "Each knows only their own position. None knows about the others." He paused. "It's a more robust system than a single chain. Severing one link doesn't interrupt the rest." Cersei turned from the window. Qyburn was seated at the table with his notes arranged before him, his expression attentive and mild, in the way of a man discussing crop rotation, rather than the structural preparation of a city for mass detonation. She had learned over years of working with him that his calmness was not indifference. It was simply that the scale of a problem never altered his relationship to its solvability. He looked at everything with the same clear, acquisitive attention. It was useful. It was also, she occasionally thought, the most frightening thing she had ever kept on a leash. "And the Scorpions," she said. 12 repositioned to the harbor wall and the southern battlements. 6 more in mobile configuration on the lower city platforms. They can be traversed quickly if the target's approach vector changes." He consulted his notes. "I've also had the ammunition redesigned. Wider spread on impact, less initial penetration, more mechanical disruption. If the iron shell is breached by conventional means, I suspect the contents are more vulnerable than the exterior suggests." "You suspect?" "I have no sample data. Suspicion is the honest word." He looked up. "If the opportunity to obtain a sample presents itself, it won't." She sat down across from him. "He is not a specimen. He is a problem we are managing around. We don't catch him, we don't study him, we use him." Qyburn accepted this with a small nod, though something in his expression suggested he filed the contrary preference for later rather than abandoning it. "The information campaign is also in motion. Runners have been distributing accounts of the Iron Man's activities at the Trident, appropriately adjusted. The granary fire at Rushford that killed 17 people is now attributed to his weapons. There are 3 separate stories in circulation, which creates the impression of independent confirmation. And the one about him burning dock workers? That one is performing well in the harbor district. The guild masters are repeating it without prompting." Cersei absorbed this. She thought not for the first time about the distance between what a thing was and what people believed it to be, and how that distance correctly managed was more useful than any army. Armies cost grain and loyalty and horses. Belief cost nothing. Belief reproduced itself. "Keep the gates open," she said. "Keep them open until the city cannot breathe. And when it cannot breathe, make sure the people know who stopped them from leaving." Three days hard riding south of King's Landing in a commandeered farmhouse that smelled of old smoke and horses, Jon Snow spread the latest dispatch across the table and read it twice. The numbers had changed again. He had been tracking the advance rate of the dead for weeks with the obsessive attention of a man who understood that the margin between survivable and not was narrowing faster than any official estimate admitted. The last reliable raven from the Night's Watch had put the main body of the army at a distance that gave them perhaps 3 weeks before Winterfell would be under full pressure. That raven had been 4 days old when it arrived. He did not do the subtraction out loud because the room did not need to hear it. Tony was standing at the window. He had the suit's faceplate up, which meant he had decided the room was safe enough for the small courtesy of a visible face, an adjustment John had noticed he made inconsistently, which suggested it was not policy but instinct. When he trusted the immediate environment, the visor came up. When he was uncertain, it did not. The farmhouse was the second meeting point in 3 days. The first had been abandoned after Tyrion's outriders reported Lannister scouts in the area. The pattern was wearing on all of them in different ways, John, with the particular exhaustion of a man whose patience had never been large and was now being consumed at a rate he couldn't afford. Tony with an increasing terseness that had replaced his earlier observational irony. Tyrion with the pressed-together expression of a strategist, watching his timeline compress from every direction simultaneously. "There's a report from Sir Davos's contact in King's Landing," Tyrion said. He was holding the parchment, but not reading from it, which meant he had already memorized it and was deciding how much to share. "The gates are open. All of them. Cersei is allowing the full civilian flood from the surrounding countryside." John looked up. "That's not mercy." "No, it is not." Tyrion set the parchment down. Estimates put the current population at somewhere between 400,000 and 600,000. Normal capacity is roughly half that. The garrison cannot manage the influx and hold defensive positions simultaneously. Every commander she has is being stretched in 2 directions. "She's using them to clog the streets," Tony said from the window. He had not turned around. "Make movement impossible for an attacking force. Make sight lines irrelevant. Make any large-scale strike a mass civilian casualty event before it reaches a military target." "Yes." "She's also putting them inside the blast radius of whatever she's hiding in that city." He turned then. His eyes moved between Tyrion and John with the flat encompassing scan of a man who had been running analyses continuously for hours. "My thermal imaging shows heat signatures consistent with stored accelerant at 12 separate points inside the walls. Not granaries. The distribution is wrong for grain storage too, spread too close to structural supports. It's been placed." The room was very still. "Wildfire," Tyrion said. The word came out smaller than he intended. "I don't know what you call it here. I know what it looks like on a thermal scan. I know it's positioned to take down load-bearing infrastructure in the harbor district, the lower city, and the main market approach." Tony crossed to the table and stood at the edge of it, not sitting. "I also know that whatever she's planning, it requires a trigger event. She's not going to light her own city on purpose without something to blame it on." John looked at him. "She'll blame it on you. Or on Daenerys. Or on both, depending on who's in range when she decides the calculation has shifted." He picked up the Northern Dispatch from the table, read it once, and set it back down. His jaw tightened slightly, the only visible indicator of what the numbers meant. "I know what you're about to say. The North is getting worse faster than we planned for." "Yes." Tony held his gaze on the northern markers on the map. "I know. I've been running the same math you have. If I go south now, I'm spending weeks on a problem that could have waited, while the problem that can't wait gets 3 weeks closer to catastrophic. Then you understand why I can't give you a week for King's Landing." "I understand why you can't." He looked at John with something that wasn't resentment and wasn't warmth, but existed in the specific register of 2 people who respected each other's logic even when it was inconvenient. "I also can't leave 500,000 people inside a city that's been rigged to kill them. That's not a strategic calculation. That's just a number I can't walk away from." John was quiet for a moment. Outside, a horse shifted against its post, and the wind came through the gap in the wall, with the sharp, specific bite of a winter that had been advancing for months and showed no interest in stopping. "How long?" John said. 3 days to clear the military infrastructure and open exits for the civilian population. Maybe 4. The dead don't give us 4-day windows. I know. Tony held the map's northern edge with his eyes. What I need from you is a commitment to hold whatever position you can until I'm north. Not indefinitely. Not a sacrifice. Just long enough. He looked up. Can Winterfell hold for a week more than the current estimate gives it? Jon thought about the men on those walls. He thought about what a week meant in terms of what they had and what was coming. He thought about the answer he wanted to give and the answer that was true. I don't know, he said. Maybe, if nothing unexpected goes wrong. When does nothing unexpected going wrong ever happen? Almost never. Jon held his gaze for a moment, and something in it shifted, not agreement, but the acceptance of a man who had learned to live inside impossible arithmetic. 3 days. Then you're north. 3 days, Tony said. Tyrion had been watching this exchange with the expression of a man watching a bridge being built over a chasm, and calculating in real time whether the engineering would hold. He looked at the map, then at Jon, then at Tony. Daenerys will want to be part of the King's Landing operation, he said. I know, Tony said. She will not accept being sidelined from what she sees as her central, I know. He was already moving toward the door. Figure out her role. Keep her assets out of the civilian corridors. I'll clear the military hardware before her forces enter. After that, it's her city. He stopped at the threshold. I'm not fighting her battle for her. I'm clearing a minefield so 500,000 people don't die in it. He went outside. The cold took him immediately the way cold in Westeros always did, not gradually, but all at once like a door closing. Tyrion looked at Jon across the table. Jon was still studying the northern numbers. Euron's fleet is at the mouth of Blackwater Bay, Tyrion said. Davos's contact saw it yesterday. 40 ships minimum. The Scorpions on the harbor wall are sighted for aerial targets. He paused. He knows about the dragons. He's prepared for them. He's not prepared for Tony, Jon said. No. Tyrion looked at the door through which Tony had just walked. That is the one consistent advantage we have in this war. Nothing in it has been prepared for Tony. He poured the last of the wine and stared into it. I find that less comforting than I probably should. Outside, the red and gold figure rose into the evening sky and hung there for a moment against the darkening south, visible from a long distance, a light against the clouds that had no natural explanation, that the farmers in the fields below would look up at and argue about for weeks afterward. Whether it was a good sign or a bad one. Whether it was an angel or a demon. Whether what it was moving toward was salvation or catastrophe. As if Jon thought, watching it diminish toward the horizon, those had ever been reliably different things. He came in from the north at altitude high enough. That the city below resolved into geometry rather than detail walls, roads, the dark rectangle of the harbor. The clustered density of the lower districts, where the civilian influx had pressed bodies into every available space. The sun was 2 hours from rising. Tony had timed the approach deliberately pre-dawn, when visibility for ground-based defenders was worst, and his thermal imaging was at its sharpest, when the human body's circadian chemistry produced the specific cognitive lag that cost trained soldiers roughly 0.4 of a second on threat response. 0.4 of a second at the speeds he was operating was an enormous advantage. Friday was still gone. The suit's onboard system had been running solo for days now, and he had adapted to the absence the way you adapted to any missing tool you worked around it. You compensated, you stopped reaching for it every 30 seconds, and accepted that the hand was empty. What he had instead was raw sensor data. his own pattern recognition, and a target sequence he had been building since the thermal scans at the farmhouse. 12 heat anomalies, consistent with accelerant. 9 scorpion positions on the wall, and harbor platforms, 2 command nodes in the upper city that controlled signal relays. 1 large concentration of military asset in the harbor itself. He dealt with the scorpions first. Not because they were the biggest threat, they weren't not at altitude, but because leaving them operational meant leaving the most capable anti-air assets in Westeros active, while he worked the lower priorities. He came in steep on the first battery at the southern battlement repulsor burst at 30 yards, and the Scorpion came apart before the crew had finished the rotation sequence. The second was on the harbor wall, its crew already turning toward the sound of the first explosion, which was useful. They were facing away from his new approach vector. He hit the mechanism at the base, rather than the frame, which dropped the weapon and left the crew alive to run, which they did. 4 down in the first 90 seconds. The city began to understand something was happening. Below, torches moved. Horns started. The garrison, to their credit, had a rapid response procedure, and they executed it with reasonable speed, soldiers moving to defensive positions, gates being secured, drums carrying signals across the wall walk. All of it approximately correct by the logic of warfare they had been trained for. All of it built around the assumption that a threat would arrive at the walls from the outside at ground level, or close to it. He was already inside the walls. The 3rd and 4th Scorpion positions were on mobile platforms in the lower city, as Qyburn's preparations had placed them. He found them by the heat of their recently fired braziers and the density of soldiers clustered around them. He came in low this time, skimming the rooftops at a height that kept him below the sightlines of the upper wall batteries, and took both platforms in a single pass repulsor. Left reach, that repulsor right, the distinctive double crack of displaced air that the lower city would remember for years afterward as the sound that preceded the burning of Euron Greyjoy's fleet. The civilians were the complication he had expected and planned for. They were everywhere. Not in organized groups, not in evacuation columns, just everywhere, filling the streets and alleys and the spaces between buildings with the specific desperate press of hundreds of thousands of people who had been told the gates were open and had arrived to find the open gates increasingly useless as the crowd inside grew denser than the crowd outside. When the first explosions hit, the movement changed character. Not a panic yet, not the full crush stampede that killed more people than blades. But the first tremor of a crowd that was beginning to understand it was in the wrong place. He found the 2 largest clogged gates and opened them. The eastern gate had been ordered sealed when the alarm horn started. 3 soldiers were working a drop bar the size of a small tree. He pulled the bar out of their hands from 20 feet up and set it aside, which had the immediate effect of the gate swinging open and the soldiers staring upward with expressions he didn't stay long enough to interpret. The northern postern gate was harder. It had been locked from inside a guardhouse, and the mechanism required physical manipulation at ground level. He landed, worked it in 11 seconds, and was back in the air before the crowd outside had finished processing the fact that the door had opened on its own. People began moving through. He gave himself 10 seconds to watch the flow establish itself. Good fast, no immediate crush points, and then turned east toward the harbor. Euron Greyjoy saw the light coming before he understood what it was. He was standing at the prow of the Silence, which was where he preferred to stand when something interesting was happening. And something interesting had been happening for the past 6 minutes in the form of distant explosions from the city that carried the specific quality of things being destroyed professionally rather than burning accidentally. His fleet was positioned in 3 lines across the mouth of Blackwater Bay. Scorpions charged and traversed for aerial approach crews at their stations. Everything exactly as he had arranged it when Qyburn's people had brought him the intelligence on the Iron Man 3 days prior. He had studied that intelligence with great interest. A man in a shell of red metal that flew and shot fire. A man who had cleared the Trident crossing and destroyed 11 walking dead outside a farmhouse, and had by all accounts taken Lannister's scorpion fire at close range and been inconvenienced rather than killed. Euron had read all of this and felt something he hadn't felt in years, the specific clarifying excitement of encountering something genuinely worth killing. The drowned god gave gifts to those who reached for them. The greatest gifts required the greatest reach. The light resolved into a shape moving fast across the water toward him, low and direct, trailing 2 lines of blue-white propulsion that turned the bay's surface into a mirror beneath it. His scorpion crews had it ranged. He heard the firing commands go out across 3 ships simultaneously. The bolts crossed the water at extreme velocity and hit nothing. The shape had already changed direction, not gradually, not in the arc of anything he had ever seen fly, but instantaneously a hard, angular break that no bird or dragon could execute, and then it was inside his first line, before the reload was halfway complete. The first ship in the line lost its scorpion to a burst of blue energy that also took the mast above it. The second lost its rudder. Euron watched this from the Silence's prow, with the focused attention of a man recalibrating in real time. Not retreating, not afraid, simply updating his model of what he was dealing with. He had a new model within 20 seconds. This thing moved in 3 dimensions with a freedom that made his fleet's formation irrelevant. The formation had been designed for targets that operated on a plane. This target did not operate on a plane. He could have ordered a retreat. He ordered the fleet to close instead, drawing the lines tighter, more ships converging on the iron shape's position, because the alternative was to let it work the fleet from outside engagement range, and that was simply not how Euron Greyjoy intended to lose anything. Tony registered the tightening formation and understood its logic. They were trying to mass enough bolts in a concentrated area to guarantee a hit, regardless of his evasion. It was a reasonable response to a problem they didn't have the right tools to solve. He changed altitude, went up 60 feet above the mast line, and looked at the fleet with the cold, systematic attention of a man reading a map. 41 ships, scorpions on 23 of them, concentrated in the center where the lines had closed. The flanks were lighter, faster ships, skirmishers positioned to pursue rather than fight. The flagship was identifiable by its size and by the figure standing at its prow, who had not moved despite everything burning around him, which was either extraordinary courage or a specific kind of madness that had decided dying impressively was the priority. He started with the ammunition stores. Each ship carried its scorpion bolts in sealed crates on the main deck or just below it. He could see them by the density of the wooden structure and the slight differential in heat signature from stored metal against aged timber. He didn't hit the bolts directly at the concentrations involved that would take out the surrounding crew and half the ship in ways that weren't necessary. He hit the traversal mechanisms on the scorpions themselves, the rotating base and the tension assembly which rendered each weapon inoperable in a single strike, without producing the secondary explosions that made collateral management complicated. 17 scorpions disabled in 4 minutes. The fleet was still fighting soldiers with crossbows, spears, burning pitch. But they were fighting the way men fought a storm, with the conviction of people who needed to do something and had run out of better options. The silence was last. He came in at deck level slower than he'd moved all night and landed on the prow 30 feet from Euron Greyjoy. Euron didn't run. Tony had not expected him to. The man was large, scarred across the left side of his face in a way that suggested a story, and armed with a short axe and a longer blade that he was holding with the loose-wristed competence of someone who had used them both in serious circumstances. His crew had backed away. He had not. "I've killed better things than you," Euron said. His voice was steady, almost conversational. He was grinning. "I sincerely doubt that," Tony said. Euron came forward at a speed that was genuinely impressive for a man his size. He was fast and technically sound and completely committed, the axe leading high as a draw and the blade coming low. A combination that would have been highly effective against anything in his reference set. Tony stepped left, let the axe pass wide, caught the wrist on the blade side, and used the man's own momentum to put him face down on the deck. He held him there with one armored knee and one hand and looked at the crew who had not moved. "Anyone else?" he said. Nobody moved. He stood left Euron on the deck and looked at the Silence's Scorpion. He removed the tension assembly in a single pull and dropped it into the bay. Then he looked at the crew again. "Abandon ship," he said. "Use the rowboats. You have 8 minutes before I start sinking hulls." He was back in the air before the first rowboat hit the water. Ta-ta! Tyrion watched from the ridge south of the city as the bay burned. He had a good position, high ground clear sightlines across the harbor, approached close enough to see the individual fires on the water, and far enough that the sound reached him a full second after the light. He had been watching for 40 minutes. He had stopped counting the explosions at 30. Beside him, Jon stood with his arms crossed and his face turned toward the harbor and said nothing for a long time. "In the old histories," Tyrion said finally, "there are accounts of Valyrian dragon lords taking cities. Descriptions of what it looked like from outside the walls." He paused. "This is faster." Jon said nothing. "The strategic situation has changed in ways I am still calculating." Tyrion turned his cup in his hands. He had brought wine, which was either foresight or a character flaw, possibly both. "Cersei has lost her fleet, her wall artillery, and her outer defensive capacity in a single night. What she retains is Red Keep, her personal guard, whatever Qyburn has prepared underground, and approximately 500,000 civilians who are currently discovering that some of the gates are open." "She'll have planned for this," Jon said. "Yes, which is the part that concerns me." Tyrion looked at the fires on the water. "She has never, in my experience, spent a resource without getting something back for it. The fleet was a resource. If it's gone and she's still calm, she got something for it." Below them, through the gap in the southern wall that Tony had opened 40 minutes ago, a river of people was moving. Not running, walking, the specific exhausted shuffle of bodies that had been waiting too long and were now finally incomprehensibly allowed to move. Families with bundles, old men leaning on younger ones. Children carried children, walking children who had stopped crying and were simply staring at the burning sky with the wide, absorptive attention of people watching something they would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe. One woman stopped at the gate threshold and looked up, not at the burning harbor, not at the walls, up at the thing that had opened this gate, still visible as a moving light against the pre-dawn dark, working the harbor district with the systematic efficiency of something that did not tire and did not hesitate. She stood there for a full breath, and then she made the sign of the seven and walked through. Jon watched her go. 3 days, he said. It was not a reminder. It was a calculation being run in real time. Yes, Tyrion said. 3 days. In the harbor, the last of the Silence's escort ships caught fire at the waterline and began to go under slowly the way large things went under, reluctantly in stages. The upper structure still burning, while the hull descended into the dark water of Blackwater Bay. Euron Greyjoy was somewhere in a rowboat, or he wasn't, and the Iron Fleet was becoming wreckage, and high above it all, the red and gold shape banked toward the upper city, where Red Keep sat on its hill, with its lights burning and its gates shut. Cersei was still in there. And the night Tony understood as he gained altitude over the smoking harbor was not finished. Red Keep had 2 faces. The one visible from outside was stone and towers and the accumulated authority of 3 centuries. A structure designed to communicate permanence and power to anyone who approached from below. The one visible from inside at 4 in the morning, with the harbor burning, and the garrison in collapse, was narrower corridors and locked doors, and the smell of old stone damp with generations of things that had happened here, and been carefully not recorded. Tony moved through it from below. He had come in through the postern passage on the keep's eastern face, a service entrance, according to the scan he'd done from altitude used by kitchen staff and the occasional quiet departure that didn't require a public gate. The passage was dark and low-ceilinged and empty. Everyone who had been in it an hour ago had made decisions about where they wanted to be when the explosion started, and those decisions had taken them away from the postern passage. He did not blame them. The thermal imaging put Cersei somewhere in the upper structure throne room level, possibly one floor above. It also put something else 2 levels below him in a basement complex that showed heat signatures inconsistent with storage. Too much activity, too many warm objects in too deliberate an arrangement. He knew what deliberate arrangements of warm objects in underground rooms meant by now. He had seen them in places with different names and worse records. He went down first. The lab was cleaner than it should have been. That was the first thing Tony registered when he pushed through the door at the bottom of the stone stairs, the cleanliness. Not sterile, not clinical in any modern sense, but maintained, organized. Tools on hooks, surfaces wiped, jars on shelves with their contents labeled in a small, careful hand. It looked like the workspace of someone who took pride in their methodology, which was the most disturbing thing about it because the methodology was visible in everything else the room contained. The shelves had specimens. He did not inventory them in detail because detail was not necessary. The general category was immediately legible, and that was enough. A long table against the far wall held an open journal beside an arrangement of instruments that a physician might use, except that no physician would have arranged them in exactly that sequence or for exactly those purposes. In the center of the room, on a raised platform, stood something that had been a man once. It was very large. What had been done to make it what it was now occupied the space where a person's history should have been. Gregor Clegane, or what remained of him, turned toward Tony with the slow, absolute attention of something that had been repurposed. Tony hit him with a repulsor burst at close range that staggered him back 2 steps. The thing did not fall. He hit it again, harder, and watched the structural damage register in his thermal sensors, joint trauma material compromise in the left shoulder assembly. But the thing came forward again, unimpressed by damage the way things were, unimpressed by damage when they no longer processed pain as meaningful data. He used the energy blade. It took 4 seconds and required more force than he had budgeted for. And when it was over, he stood in the center of the clean lab amid the wreckage of what Qyburn's careful methodology had produced and felt something that was not satisfaction and was not horror, but existed in the narrow register between them. The cold recognition that he was looking at the end point of a road that started with the premise that knowledge had no limits and people had no value except as material for acquiring more of it. Remarkable. Qyburn's voice came from the doorway behind him. Tony turned. The man was older than he'd expected, small, gray-haired, wearing a dark robe that had the look of a garment chosen for practicality rather than presentation. He stood at the threshold with his hands at his sides and his face composed in the mild, attentive expression of someone who had arrived at an interesting juncture in an ongoing experiment. He looked at Tony, then at the wreckage on the platform, then back at Tony, and what moved across his face was not grief or rage, but something closer to professional assessment. "I had wondered about the structural tolerances," Qyburn said. "The bonding of the enhancements to the original skeletal framework was never fully tested against forces at that magnitude. Now I know." He took 1 step into the room. "You are, if I may say, the most extraordinary subject I have encountered in 30 years of inquiry." "I'm not a subject," Tony said. "Everyone is a subject if one looks at them with the right instrument." Qyburn moved to the journal on the far table unhurried and made a small notation in it. The pen moved with the comfortable automaticity of a man who had been writing in this journal for a long time. Knowledge requires material. Material requires acquisition. The ethical frameworks that constrain most practitioners are, I have found, simply a failure of imagination, a refusal to follow a question to its end, because the end is uncomfortable. He set the pen down and looked up. What you carry in that suit represents more advancement than this civilization will achieve in 500 years. Tell me, did you hesitate at the beginning? Did you place limits on what questions you would ask? Yes, Tony said. I placed limits. And did those limits make you less than what you could have been? They made me something worth being. He looked at the journal, the shelves, the instruments, the thing on the platform that had been a person. You've been doing this to people. I have been extending the boundaries of what people can be. No, Tony said. You've been ending what people are and replacing it with what you want them to become. That's not extension. That's erasure. He looked at Qyburn for a moment, at the mild face, the steady hands, the complete absence of anything that recognized what the room contained as wrong. You don't see it. I see it very clearly. I simply disagree with your framework for... He ended it there. Not because the argument was lost, or because Qyburn had said something unanswerably clever, but because the room was full of evidence that the argument had already been settled by action long before words arrived, and adding more words to it would have been a form of respect it didn't deserve. The strike was fast and precise, and Qyburn was dead before the journal hit the floor. Tony stood in the lab for 3 seconds. He burned it on his way out. He was 2 floors above the lab, moving toward the throne room level, when the city spoke. Not the harbor. The harbor had been speaking in the language of burning ships for the past hour, and he had grown calibrated to that register. This was different. This came from the lower residential districts, a sequence of detonations spread across a half-mile radius, each one close enough to the others that they arrived almost as a single event, but distinct enough to be read as separate sources. Not a chain reaction, not an accident. Coordinated manual ignition from multiple positions, triggered close together by people who had been waiting for the right moment. The right moment had been when he went below ground, and the surface-level threat pressure dropped. He was already moving before the 3rd detonation finished echoing. He came up through the postern passage, hit open air, and pulled altitude fast enough to see the smoke columns rising from 4 points in the lower city before he had fully processed the number. The thermal scan showed fire spreading laterally through the residential blocks. Old timber construction dry from the winter, packed with people who had nowhere to go, because the streets were still full of those trying to leave through the eastern gates. He counted the fires and started with the ones closest to population concentration. What followed was not combat. It was triage at speed, repulsor bursts to collapse burning structures onto themselves. Before the fire spread laterally, 2 collapsed alley walls opened with targeted strikes to create emergency exit routes. A section of crowd being pushed from behind by fire on 3 sides, redirected by the simple expedient of him landing in the middle of it and pointing clearly and repeatedly at the exit he had opened. People ran. He cleared the next fire source before the one behind him finished dying. He saved most of them, not all. A building in the tannery quarter came down before he reached it. Old construction, the fire had moved faster through the upper floor than his approach vector predicted. He heard it collapse from 2 blocks away and changed course anyway, because there were survivors in the rubble, and extracting them from burning rubble at 4 in the morning was a different kind of work than clearing scorpion batteries. But it was still work that could be done. And he did it until the fires around him had been reduced to the kind that burned themselves out rather than spread. Then he went back to Red Keep. The throne room was empty. Cersei was not on the throne. She was standing at the far window, hands clasped behind her back, looking out over the harbor and the lower city. With the composed attention of someone surveying damage she had already calculated and found acceptable. She heard him come in and did not turn immediately. When she did, her face carried the particular stillness of a person who had decided some time earlier that reacting visibly was a form of surrender. "How many?" she said. He understood the question. "I don't have a final count, but more than if I hadn't done it." "Yes." She held his gaze. She was even now a striking woman, the kind of presence that a room organized itself around without being asked. He saw in her face the intelligence that had operated the most complex political structure in Westeros for years. The will that had survived everything the world had sent against it, and the absolute zero at the center of it all, where ordinary human feeling had been replaced by the calculus of survival and power. It was not madness. It was worse than madness. It was clarity of a type that had decided long ago that the people burning in the lower city were variables in an equation, not people in a city. "You came to end it," she said. "I came to stop you from doing more. I've already done what I came to do." She looked back at the window. The fires in the lower district were dimming his work over the past hour. "You'll be blamed, you know. Not all of it, but enough. The stories are already moving. By morning, half the city will have heard that the Iron Man's weapons destroyed the Tannery district. A quarter of them will believe it. That quarter will tell the other half." A pause. "That's how this works?" "I know how it works. Do you?" She turned back. "You come from somewhere else. Somewhere with different rules. Here it doesn't matter what you did or didn't do. It matters what people can be made to believe. And they can always be made to believe something. That stops when you stop." A long silence. In it, the distant sounds of the city fire bells, voices the particular low roar of a large crowd processing a collective disaster. "Then stop it," she said. He closed the exits. Not with a weapon, with the suit itself, moving to each doorway and collapsing the structural support above it, bringing the stone down in controlled drops that sealed each passage cleanly. She watched him do it and said nothing. When the last one was closed, she stood in the sealed room and looked at the rubble, and then at him, and the expression on her face was something he had not expected. Not fear, not rage, not the theatrical defiance of a villain accepting defeat. It was something closer to recognition. The look of a person who had finally encountered a force that did not operate by the rules she had spent her life mastering. "My children would have been good rulers," she said, quietly. Not to him, not to the room, to something else entirely. He left her in the dark and sealed the last exit behind him. Tyrion was waiting outside the main gate when Tony emerged. He had ridden hard to reach the city and arrived in time to watch the lower district fires die and the smoke begin its slow rise into a sky that was starting at the eastern edge to consider the possibility of dawn. He looked at Tony. His face had the compressed, careful blankness of a man who had prepared himself for bad news and received it and was now converting it into something he could work with. "How bad?" Tyrion said. "The fires are out. I don't have a civilian count yet." "The story? Already moving?" Tony looked at the smoke. "She set it up before I got there. The Tannery district. Blamed on my weapons." Tyrion closed his eyes for a moment. The mathematics of it were running behind his face. "How many people believe it?" "Some. Enough to matter." "Cersei. She's in Red Keep, under it." A pause. "She won't be moving." Tyrion opened his eyes. He looked at the city, The walls, the gates, the smoke columns diminishing in the morning wind, the streams of people still moving through the opened exits into the farmlands south and west. He looked at all of it for a long time. "She spent her entire position to make your victory cost something," he said. Not an accusation. An observation delivered with the weariness of a man who had known Cersei Lannister for 30 years and had never, in all that time, managed to be fully prepared for the depth of what she was capable of. "Yes. And it worked?" Tony said nothing. From somewhere in the lower city, a woman was calling a name, not screaming. Just calling the voice of someone who had been separated from someone and was still looking, because the alternative to looking was something she wasn't prepared to consider yet. "It worked," he said. "The sun came up over King's Landing and found it standing and found it in ruins and found the two things were not mutually exclusive, that a city could survive and still carry inside it. The weight of what had been done to survive the uncountable private disasters that no military victory could account for or undo." Tony stood in the smoke and knew the North was still waiting, and knew the count of people he hadn't reached in time would be with him on the road there. The smoke over King's Landing had not fully cleared by mid-morning. It hung in layers, the gray-white of timber fires dyeing the darker columns from the harbor, where the fleet's tar and pitch still burned at the waterline, and beneath everything, the thinner, uglier haze that sat over the tannery district and did not move because there was no wind to move it, and nothing underneath it that was generating heat anymore. Tyrion stood on the ridge south of the city with Varys beside him and looked at the smoke and did not speak for a while. "She's been on the cliff since before dawn," Varys said. He was watching the headland a quarter-mile east where the grass fell away to nothing and the sea was visible below. Daenerys stood there alone, her back to both of them. Drogon was somewhere above, audible before, visible the deep rhythmic beat of his wings, carrying across the still morning air from the direction of the ruined harbor. "She has not sent for anyone." "That is not a good sign," Tyrion said. "No." He had spent the night thinking about what he would say when this moment arrived, running through every version of the argument he knew, and he had arrived at the conclusion that there was no version that worked. The problem was not phrasing. The problem was that Daenerys had woken this morning to a city she had spent years moving toward, and found it already the military infrastructure dismantled, the walls, breached Cersei dead, the harbor emptied of its fleet, and Tony Stark standing in the smoke as though he had simply done a job and was ready to move to the next one. The chieftaincy of that victory had never been offered. It had simply happened around her. He knew what that felt like, to have a thing you believed was yours slip sideways before you could close your hand around it. He had felt it at his trial at his father's dinner table in every room where being a Lannister of small stature meant the conversation had already ended before it began. The difference was that he had learned over decades to absorb that feeling and convert it into something useful. Daenerys had never had to learn that. She had spent her entire adult life becoming someone that things happened toward, not around. "She'll want to speak to him," Tyrion said. "She'll want to do more than speak." Varys' voice was neutral, as it almost always was, carrying the mild, absolute attention of a man who had spent 30 years reading rooms and had grown so practiced at it that reading rooms had become indistinguishable from breathing. "I have been thinking about what she said last night." "Which part?" "She said a Westeros that remembers being saved by him is a Westeros that does not need saving by me." Varys paused. She said it quietly, to herself primarily. She did not know I was within hearing. Tyrion looked at the smoke. "That's not anger," he said. "That's a conclusion." "Yes," Varys said. "It is." And Tony found out about it from Jon. Jon came to him at the camp east of the city, where the remains of the Northmen's column had made temporary position. And he did not come with a greeting or a preamble. He came with the direct, stripped-down delivery of a man conveying information he wished he did not have. Her riders have been moving since first light. She's drawn the Dothraki from the eastern staging ground toward the city. He handed Tony a folded note. This came from Tyrion an hour ago. Tony read it. Tyrion's handwriting was small and precise. She intends to make a demonstration. Her words. I do not believe demonstration means what she needs it to mean today. I am trying. I do not believe I am succeeding. Be aware. He handed it back. Where is she now? Tony said. The cliff above the southern harbor. Drogon's been circling the headland. Jon held his gaze steady. There are still people in the lower city. 2, maybe 3,000 who couldn't move last night. I know. If she brings a dragon over a crowd that dense. I know. Tony was already running the calculation. 2,000 people in the lower residential district, most of them in buildings or moving toward the southern exits. Drogon's wingspan in close quarters over stone streets. The margins on redirecting that kind of pass, once committed, were very small. He thought about the morning air, the smoke still cutting visibility from ground level, the headland where she was standing. He thought about what she had asked for at the sea's depth and what he had said and what she had heard in the saying of it. He thought about a woman who had survived being sold, exiled, widowed, and betrayed, who had crossed a sea with 3 dragon eggs and no army, and had built everything she had from nothing, and who had arrived at a city that should have been the proof of that effort and found the proof already claimed. I'm going to talk to her first, he said. Jon said nothing. His expression carried the particular weight of a man who had seen enough of the world to know that talking first was always the right intention and frequently the wrong outcome, but who also understood that the alternative was worse. 3 days, Jon said. You said 3 days and then north. I know what I said. He went up. Saros. She was still on the cliff when he came down out of the sky and landed 20 feet behind her. She heard him. The suit was not quiet, but she did not turn immediately. She stood at the edge and looked at the harbor below, at the burned hulls sitting in the shallows, at the smoke still ghosting off the water. Drogon felt him from above and angled closer. The shadow of those wings crossed the cliff face and the grass, and them both enormous and cold. Tony tracked the dragon's approach vector with his sensors and did not move. Not a threat display, just awareness. You should have waited, Daenerys said. She turned then. Her face was composed the way faces were composed when composure was the last available form of control. You should have let me take the city. 600,000 people were inside a city rigged to detonate, Tony said. There was no waiting. There was a week. 2, you could have held the perimeter, secured the exits. Let me bring my armies to the walls and let the population see who came to free them. Her voice did not rise. It had the quality of someone who had rehearsed this argument alone for hours and had arrived at something very close to certainty. Instead, they will remember the Iron Man who fell from the sky, not the queen who crossed the sea. They'll remember whoever kept them alive. Memory is not that simple. Something moved behind her eyes. Not rage, but the deep structural pressure of a belief being tested against a reality that refused to confirm it. You have done this twice now. The Trident, King's Landing. Each time you have been the story. Each time the thing that should have drawn people toward me has drawn them towards something that cannot be part of what I am building. Because I won't stand behind your claim. Because you won't stand anywhere. The composure fractured slightly at the edges, controlled immediately, but visible. You appear, you act, you leave. And in your absence, you leave behind a question, if he could do this. Why do we need anyone? Why do we need order, governance, a queen? Why do we need anything except the man in the iron suit to come down when things go wrong? She stepped forward. Do you understand what that question does to a world that needs to function without you? Tony looked at her. He looked at the intelligence in her face. The genuine force of the argument, the way she had arrived at a conclusion that was internally coherent and externally catastrophic. He had heard versions of this argument before from people who wanted control of a thing they feared losing and had constructed a philosophy around the fear. He had also heard it from people who were not entirely wrong. You're asking me to make myself smaller so the structure can feel stable, he said. I am asking you to understand that stability is not nothing. I understand that. I also understand that the structure you're protecting was producing mass starvation and burning farms and locked granaries before I got here. Stability built on that foundation isn't stability. It's a postponed catastrophe. He held his ground. I told you at the Septi what I would and wouldn't do. Nothing has changed. The silence between them had weight. Below, the harbor moved in the morning wind, and Drogon's shadow crossed the cliff again, slower this time, lower. I cannot build what needs to be built, Daenerys said quietly. If there is something in this world that does not answer to any authority, not mine, not anyone's, a power that moves freely and answers only to itself is not an ally. It is a permanent challenge to every legitimate claim. Then challenge me legitimately, Tony said. Govern well. Build something worth defending. If people choose order because the order is good, you don't need me to prop it up. And if they choose you instead, then you built something that needed propping up. Drogon came in from the east at a steep angle and hit the cliff face below with enough downdraft to stagger a standing man. Tony held his footing. The dragon pulled up and banked. And in the banking, the morning light caught the scales across his neck. Deep black shading into dark red at the edges, the size of him against the sky, the size of something that should not have to negotiate with anything. Daenerys looked at Tony for one more moment. I gave you the chance to stand with me, she said. At the Sept, you declined. A pause very small. I gave it again today. I know. Then we are finished talking. Drogon came around again, and she walked 3 steps, and he was there, the great head dipping the wing, curving to receive her. She went up. Tony went up after her. What followed happened above the ruins of King's Landing's southern harbor, in the airspace, over burned ships and empty walls at an altitude where the people still in the lower city were small enough that their presence registered as heat signatures rather than faces. He pulled them up deliberately, gaining height before engaging, because the alternative was fighting at rooftop level over a dense residential area. Drogon followed faster than most things his size had any right to be, the speed built from muscle and scale, and the particular aerodynamics of a creature whose entire form had evolved around the requirement to catch things that ran. The first fire came without warning, a full breath of it, broad and white at the center orange, at the periphery hot enough that the nano-shield registered the pressure as structural stress rather than just heat. He rolled out of it, came back from the left, and put a repulsor burst into Drogon's left wing joint, not full charge, a disruption shot the kind that interrupted muscle control without structural damage. Drogon screamed. It was a sound that had no equivalent in any register Tony had encountered. Not pain exactly, more the fury of something that had never been successfully opposed and was encountering the concept for the first time. He banked hard and came back at Tony from above, which was where dragons preferred to be, and the shadow of him blotted out a quarter of the sky. Tony went vertical, full thrust straight up above the attack arc, and then inverted and came back down along Drogon's spine from behind. Energy Blade activated a single controlled cut along the trailing edge of the right wing membrane. Not through the bone, through the tissue, a surgical disruption that would ground the wing within minutes without killing the animal. Drogon rolled. The roll was violent enough that Daenerys had to lock her grip and ride it out rather than direct it. And in the recovery, she pulled him up and away from Tony's position, creating distance, reassessing. Below the second dragon, She-Eagle had been circling at lower altitude, and now he angled up toward the engagement. Two of them. He had expected this. He broke left, drawing Reshape's approach, and hit him with a micro-missile cluster that detonated at close range, designed for area disruption, not penetration. The blast caught Rhaegal across the chest and shoulder and knocked him sideways with a sound like a sail tearing, and he went into a spiral that took him 300 feet down before he pulled out one wing, working at reduced efficiency, the other trailing. Drogon came back. Tony took the fire on the nano shield partially. The shield absorbed approximately 60%, and the remaining 40% registered across the suit's left arm and torso as significant thermal load. Not catastrophic. Enough to matter. He felt the heat through the suit's insulation in the way you felt a very hot surface through a thick glove, not burning, but present a reminder that the margin existed and was not infinite. He came in close on Drogon's next pass, inside the fire arc, inside the wing reach, and used the repulsor cannon at the shoulder joint full charge this time. The impact was visible from the ground. Drogon's left wing folded involuntarily, and the great body pitched and listed, and Daenerys fought for control, and for 3 seconds, the largest living creature in Westeros was falling. Then Drogon caught himself. One wing beating hard, the other trailing, he leveled out at low altitude above the harbor water and stayed there, not flying so much as refusing to stop. Tony came down to 50 feet above the water and held position in front of them. "Stop," he said. The suit's external speaker carried it across the harbor. "You can stop this here." Daenerys on Drogon's back, one wing, damaged over the gray water of Blackwater Bay. She looked at him across the 50 feet of air between them. He could see her face clearly at this range. The exhaustion, the certainty, the grief of someone who had decided what she was doing was necessary and was paying the full cost of that decision in real time. "You have one more chance," she said. Her voice carried without effort. "Stand with me. Acknowledge what I am building. Be part of it." "I can't do that." "Then I have nothing left to offer you, except this." Drogon opened his mouth. Tony fired first. The unibeam at full charge hit Drogon in the chest at close range, and the impact was total, a force that moved through scale and bone and the entire massive structure, and Drogon went into the water and did not come back up cleanly. The thrashing was brief. The harbor went still. Daenerys was in the water. He was at the surface in 2 seconds and had her out in 3. She was alive. The water was cold, and the fall had been violent, and she was alive. He brought her to the nearest intact section of harbor wall and set her down, and she sat against the stone and looked at him with eyes that had nothing left in them that resembled a queen. "I told you," he said quietly. "You could have stopped." She looked at the harbor, at the place where Drogon had gone under. Her hands were shaking not from cold, or not only from cold. "I know," she said. Her voice was very small. He did not think she was talking to him. He stood back and gave her the distance and looked at the ruined harbor and the smoke and the city behind it, and thought about the north, and thought about the fact that the person sitting against the wall behind him had crossed a sea to free slaves and had arrived at a point where she had brought a dragon against a man for the crime of not belonging to her, and could not identify the distance between those two things. After a moment, he heard her breathing change. He turned. She was still sitting against the wall. She was not moving. Her eyes were open, and she was looking at the water, and she was not moving. He checked her vitals. The fall, the cold, the shock, any one of those, in combination with the others, for a person who had been on a dragon at altitude and hit the water at speed. He stood there for a moment. Then he radioed for Tyrion. Jon was waiting on this harbor wall when Tyrion arrived. He had watched the combat from below, all of it, including the end, including what happened after, and he stood with his arms crossed and his face toward the water and said nothing when Tyrion came to stand beside him. Below, Tony was still at the waterline. "She's gone," Tyrion said. Not a question. He had seen enough from the distance. "Yes." Tyrion was quiet for a long time. Below the harbor, water was still. The smoke had thinned. Somewhere in the city, people were beginning to move again. The sounds of the living, sorting through what the night had left them, the specific industry of survival. Resuming one task at a time. All of it, Tyrion said finally. Everything she survived, everything she built. He stopped. Jon did not fill the silence. There was nothing useful to put in it. After a while, from somewhere in the rubble south of the harbor, a raven arrived. It came in hard and fast, the way ravens came when the message was urgent. And it landed on the parapet beside Jon and sat there with its chest heaving. Jon took the message. He read it. He read it again. 2 more outposts, he said. The advance line is closer than the last estimate by 8 days. Tyrion looked at him. Jon looked at the raven, then at the water, then at the city. "We need to move," he said. The raven that arrived at midday had been flying for 3 days, and it showed. The bird landed on Jon's arm and sat there with its feathers tight and its eyes half closed, and the message tied to its leg was written in a hand that had gone uneven toward the end. Not from cold, Jon knew, but from the particular unsteadiness of someone writing in the dark, with inadequate light and inadequate time, and the sounds of something outside the room getting louder. The message said, "Eastwatch remnant reached Deepwood. 41 survivors. Wall has no garrison. The dead move south in numbers we cannot estimate. Please hurry. No name. No house sigil." Either the writer had been in too much haste or they had stopped caring about formality, which in Jon's experience meant the same thing. He read it twice, then walked to where Tony was standing over a rough map of the northern road and placed it on the table without speaking. Tony read it once. "How far are we from Winterfell?" he said. 4 days at cavalry pace. 3 if the roads hold. Tony looked at the map. His eyes moved across it with the focused efficiency of someone solving a spatial problem rather than reading geography. What slows the column? The downed bridge at the stone mill crossing. A ford in the Wolf's Wood that's flood-prone this time of year. The resupplies stop at Hornwood if the stores there are still intact. "I can clear the bridge in 20 minutes. I'll run recon on the ford tonight and mark the crossing point." Hornwood. He looked up. "Send a rider ahead with a requisition. If the stores are there, they'll have it staged by the time we arrive." "If the stores are there," Jon said. "If they're not, we eat light for 2 days and move faster." He folded the map. "I can cut a day off the pace if I'm running scout and dressing ahead. The column follows my line, not the roads." Jon looked at him. He had stopped being surprised by the efficiency of how Tony's mind worked, the way it moved immediately past what couldn't be changed toward what could be adjusted. It was a different kind of practicality than Jon's own, which was built on the acceptance of loss and the extraction of maximum effort from whatever remained. Tony's version didn't accept the loss first. It looked for the door before conceding the room was sealed. "Tyrion needs to know we're leaving the political wreckage behind," Jon said. "Tyrion knows. He needs to hear it said." "Then say it to him." Tony picked up his helmet. "I'll be at the stone mill crossing by nightfall." Tyrion was sitting outside the command tent when Jon found him a cup held in both hands, looking at nothing in particular with the expression of a man whose thoughts had outrun the available ground. He had aged visibly since King's Landing, not in the way bodies aged, but in the way faces did, when the gap between what a person had expected and what had actually happened became too wide to hold without showing. "She used to laugh," Tyrion said when Jon sat down beside him. "Not often, but occasionally something would strike her as genuinely funny, and she would laugh, and for a moment you could see the girl who had grown up with nothing and found things worth finding. I keep trying to remember the last time I saw that." Jon said nothing. There was nothing useful in it. "I know," Tyrion said. "I know there's no time." He looked at his cup. "I simply wanted to say it to someone who knew her before it gets buried under everything else that's coming." "It's said," Jon told him. Tyrion nodded. He drank the rest of his cup and set it aside and stood up with the careful movement of a man reassembling himself into a functional configuration. "The Unsullied commanders are asking about chain of command. The Dothraki are asking about going home. I have approximately 14 hours of political crisis management ahead of me before I can even think about moving north." He straightened his cloak. "Go, take Tony, get to Winterfell. I will follow when I can and bring whatever remains coherent. The North won't wait for—" "I know it won't wait. I will move faster than you expect." A pause. "I am very motivated." Jon believed him. Nah, Tony cleared the stone mill bridge in 18 minutes. The structure had been partially collapsed, not by the dead, but by the retreating garrison. 3 weeks earlier, the old military logic of denying crossing points to a pursuing force. Good logic against an army that needed bridges. Entirely irrelevant against one that walked through rivers. He rebuilt the central span using the structural wreckage already present, and a series of repulsor-assisted placements that had the riders from Jon's advance party watching from the bank with the concentrated attention of people witnessing something they could not fully explain, but recognized as useful. The bridge held a test pass with 3 horses. It would hold the column. He was back in the air before the last echo of the work died. The Wolfswood Ford was worse than Jon's description had suggested. The water was high and fast, from snowmelt running at a depth that would have been dangerous for horses in the dark and near impossible for any supply wagon with low clearance. He flew the line twice, found a shallower crossing 200 yards upstream where a natural rock shelf reduced the depth by half, marked it with a cairn of stacked stones visible from both banks, and pushed on. He found the first dead before he reached Hornwood. They were in the forest, south of the main road, 12 of them moving in the directionless spread that meant they were between targets rather than approaching one. He took them from altitude working quickly and was done in under a minute. He scanned the surrounding area. 2 more clusters, one moving toward the road, a half-mile west, one stationary, near what had been a farmstead. He handled both, then continued north. The farmstead was worse than the clusters. The family had made it to the barn, 3 adults, 2 children, and had barricaded the doors, and the 2 dead that had found them had been working on the barricade long enough that the wood was nearly through. He pulled the dead off the doors and hit them against the frozen ground, and went still listening. Silence inside the barn, then movement. Then a child's voice saying something he couldn't hear through the walls. "It's clear," he said to the barricaded door. "You can come out." A very long pause. The door opened 3 inches. A man's face in the gap looking at the red and gold figure standing in his farmyard over 2 crumpled bodies in the dark at whatever time it was. "Are you the Iron Man?" the man said. "Yes." "The one who burned the harbor?" "I burned the enemy fleet in the harbor, yes." Another pause. Renly's wife said you also burned the tannery district. I didn't burn the tannery district. He said it flatly without heat. Someone else burned it and told people I did. That's a different thing. He looked at the farmyard, the road north the dark tree line. There's a column coming through in 4 hours. You should be on the road heading south before it arrives. The road behind us is safer than the road ahead. The door opened wider. The man's face took in the cleared farmyard. The dead that were no longer moving the sky to the north, where the clouds had a quality he didn't have a word for. Is it as bad as they say? The man asked. Up there. Tony looked north. The clouds were wrong in the way the dead were wrong. A wrongness that registered before analysis, an instinctive recognition that the thing in front of you did not operate by the rules you had learned. The sky above Winterfell's approximate direction was not dark in the way of night. It was dark in the way of something that had decided darkness was a tool and was using it. It's worse than they say, he told the man. Go south. Don't stop. He went north. Sam Tarley was awake when Tony reached Winterfell's outer perimeter awake, and apparently had been for some time sitting in the Meister's study with 3 candles and a table covered in parchment. His handwriting covering the surfaces in the dense, determined script of a man racing his own knowledge against an oncoming deadline. John had sent a writer ahead. Sam was expecting him. I've been compiling everything, Sam said without preamble, rising and moving to the table. He had the focused, slightly manic energy of someone who had converted considerable fear into considerable productivity. Every account, every description, every piece of information in the Citadel's records about the long night. Most of it's incomplete. A lot of it contradicts itself. But there are patterns. He found a specific document and held it up. The White Walkers aren't the same as the Whites. They're created differently. They move differently. They can be destroyed by dragon glass or Valyrian steel. But normal fire doesn't reliably affect them. Night King is the original. If he dies, every White he's raised falls. That's been consistent across every account I could find. Range of the effect, Tony said. Unknown. The accounts describe it as immediate and total whenever the Night King was killed. But there are only 2 accounts of that actually happening, and both of them are so old the details are suspect. What's his physical capacity? Sam blinked. I'm sorry. Speed, endurance. Can he fly? Has he been recorded as flying? Does he operate through line of sight, or can he direct units beyond visual range? Is there evidence of communication between him and the White Walkers, or is it direct neural control? He stopped, registered Sam's expression. I'm building a threat profile. Tell me what you have. Sam had clearly never been asked these questions in this sequence. He turned to his parchment with the concentrated energy of a man who had spent his life acquiring information for moments exactly like this, and was now discovering the moment had arrived. He's been recorded as physically very fast over short distances. Sam began. He threw a spear and killed a dragon in flight that's precision at range. He raised the dead at Hardhome all at once, which suggests the raising isn't sequential, it's broadcast. It's not line of sight because they've described him raising dead behind walls through barriers. He paused. He seems to know where the living are, like he's sensitive to them. Heat signatures, Tony said. I don't know what that means. Living things generate heat. If he can perceive that at range, he can track through any visual obstruction. Tony looked at the map on the wall. Winterfell, the castle layout, the approaches from the north. The dragon kill. Was that one throw? One throw. Accuracy range estimate? 200 yards, maybe more. The descriptions are imprecise, but yes, a considerable distance, and it struck true. Tony was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the map with the focused attention of a man recalculating, adjusting, finding the load-bearing elements of the problem. He's fast, precise at range, can command through barriers, and knows where living targets are. The army is a delivery mechanism. The White Walkers are a command layer. He's the switch. He turned. If I can get to him directly past the army, past the walkers, how resistant is he to high-temperature plasma energy? Sam stared at him. There's no account of anyone trying anything like dragon glass and Valyrian steel kill the White Walkers, Tony said. Both of those work through a specific material interaction. Does the Night King share that vulnerability, or is he categorically different? The accounts suggest he's different. That what kills walkers weakens him, but doesn't necessarily. Sam stopped, found a specific passage, read it. One account says he took a dragon glass blade in the chest and didn't fall. He pulled it out. Good, Tony said. Sam stared at him. Good means he's not immune. Means he processes damage the way something with a specific anatomy processes damage. That gives me a target. He looked at the map again. I need to be able to get to him without being stopped by the army, which means I need someone on the ground keeping the army occupied. That's what Winterfell is for, John said from the doorway. Tony turned. John was in the room, had been in the room for the last several minutes, standing near the entrance with Ghost at his side. He had the bearing of a man who had ridden hard and not stopped to feel it yet. I know, Tony said. I needed to understand what I'm going to do after I get there. He looked at John. How long do we have? John crossed to the window. North of the castle walls, beyond the training grounds and the outer perimeter and the last line of torches marking the edge of the defended ground, the dark was deep and very complete. But at its far horizon, where the tree line should have been a clean edge against the sky, the dark was moving. Not the movement of wind, not the movement of animals. The movement of a very large number of things that had been walking for a long time and were almost at the end of the walk. Bran says tomorrow night, John said, if the wind holds the way it's been holding. He looked at Tony. He also says the Night King knows you're here. Tony took that in, processed it, filed it. Good, he said again. Let him. Outside, the wind came off the north, with the bone-specific cold that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with what was moving through it, and the torches along the outer wall bent all at once in the same direction. And somewhere beyond the last perimeter, a sound began. That was not quite sound, more a pressure, a weight at the lower registers of hearing that the living body recognized before the brain did, the way the body always knew before the brain did when something fundamental was about to change. Winterfell held its breath, and the dead came on. The torches on the outer wall burned sideways. Not from wind alone. The killing cold was doing something to the air that went beyond weather, a pressure from the north that had no meteorological name, that made the flames lean south with the urgency of things that wanted to be somewhere else. John stood on the battlements and watched the torchlight and listened to the sound coming across the killing ground outside the walls. It was not a sound of approach. It was the sound of something that had no urgency about approach, because approach was simply what it did continuously, without hesitation, without the gap between decision and action that made human armies manageable. The dead did not accelerate as they drew close. They maintained the same pace they had held for 300 miles, and that constancy was its own kind of horror, the horror of a force that never questioned whether to continue. They'll hit the outer palisade in minutes, Tormund said from his left. He was looking north with the grim attention of a man who had fought the dead before and had not yet found a way to stop being afraid of them. counting at least 40 wide on the approach. John looked across the defensive line. 800 men on the walls and in the yard, plus the Unsullied holding the gate structure and the Dothraki positioned as mobile reserve in the middle courtyard. Every available torch, every fire basin, every brazier had been lit. The killing ground was as bright as they could make it, which was not bright enough. "Signal Stark," he said. Tormund raised a hand to the handler, 3 positions down. The signal flare went up bright red, visible through the storm for a mile or more, and 2 seconds later the sky above the northern approach changed. Tony came down the threat line from the northeast at 800 feet. Thermal array fully active and read the battlefield in the time it took to cover the first quarter mile. 1,200 whites on the primary approach, flanking element of 300 on the west side, moving through the tree line to avoid the fire basins. A concentration of 20 or more White Walkers holding position 200 yards behind the main force, the command layers separated from the front to protect it. And behind all of it, at a distance, where the thermal signature had a quality entirely unlike anything else on the field, something that registered not as warmth or cold, but as an absence, a structured negation of everything the sensors expected living or formerly living tissue to produce. He did not think about what that was yet. He had a sequence. He hit the western flanking element first, micro-missiles in a spread pattern through the tree line, not targeting individuals, targeting the terrain. The trees came down across 200 feet of approach, and the whites in and behind them piled into the obstruction with the mindless momentum of things that did not process obstacle, which bought the western wall 3 minutes at minimum. He banked hard and came across the main approach at low-altitude unibeam, sweeping in a 60-degree arc that carved a corridor through the front rank and dropped 40 bodies in 8 seconds. The ones behind stepped over the fallen and kept moving. He went higher, recalibrated, and hit the left flank with a repulsor cannon burst that collapsed a section of ground into the ditch running east of the palisade approach. 20-odd whites went into it. More came around it. The ditch had bought time when it was built, and it bought time now, but not as much time as anyone needed. And the gap between what was available and what was required was a number he had been running continuously since the thermal scan at Hornwood 2 days ago and had not found an answer for. There was no answer for it. You bought minutes, not solutions. He came back to altitude and set up a pattern north to south sweeps along the primary front, interspersed with targeted strikes on the White Walkers, maintaining position behind the army. The walkers were harder. They moved when targeted with the deliberate lateral repositioning of entities that processed threat information, unlike the whites below them, who processed only direction and obstruction. He took down 3 in the first pass, disrupted 2 more with area blasts that scattered them without kills, and marked the remaining 15 for the next sweep. Below Winterfell's outer palisade took its first impact. The gate held. It held because Brienne of Tarth was there, with 4 of the largest soldiers still standing, and because they had braced it with everything available, and because she fought for the first 4 minutes with the absolute uncomplicated ferocity of a woman who understood that the people behind the gate were the only thing that mattered, and everything in front of it was an obstacle to be removed. Jaime Lannister was on her right, his golden hand replaced months ago with a functional steel prosthetic, moving with the economical precision of a one-handed swordsman who had spent years relearning. To her left, Grey Worm held a section of the wall walk with 6 Unsullied, and the Unsullied did not break because Grey Worm had not broken since Astapor and was not going to start now. The outer palisade was a different matter. The outer stakes held for 11 minutes. They held because fire. The dead burned like everything else, and the line of braziers behind the outer ring gave archers enough illumination to shoot at range, and they shot well. But the whites in the second and third wave simply walked through the burning ones, and the ones behind those walked through those, and eventually the outer line was not a wall, but a pile, and the pile was high enough to walk over. The main gate shook 3 times and held. Then it shook a 4th time, and a horizontal crack appeared at the seam of the left panel, and Bran heard the crack and yelled for the reserve brace. And they had it in place before the 5th impact. But the 5th impact did not come because the thing that had been lifting a section of half-fallen palisade wall and using it as a ram, a giant dead, enormous the size of a small house, suddenly stopped lifting. The giant stopped because Tony had hit it twice in the back with repulsor cannon, and it was now on the ground. He had come back across the outer killing ground at the right moment. Whether the right moment was calculation or the product of a continuous scan that had flagged structural threat to the gate above all other priorities, the effect was the same. The giant was down, the gate was intact, and Brienne had 30 seconds to reinforce the crack before the next push arrived. She used them. "Thank you," she said to the sky, where a red and gold light was already pulling away toward the next problem. The sky did not answer. It was busy. Jon came off the wall at the 2nd hour to seal a gap in the eastern perimeter, where a cluster of whites had found a section of wall lower than the rest, and were stacking, literally stacking bodies on bodies, building themselves a slope. He had 4 people Longclaw and exactly enough time to hold the position until Tony's next pass cleared the stack from outside. He used the 4 people and Longclaw. He used them efficiently, which was the only available option, because the other option was the eastern perimeter failing and the courtyard filling before the gate was properly reinforced. The Valyrian steel was the only edge that worked cleanly. 2 of his 4 fighters had dragon glass, which worked too. He had confirmed that weeks ago, and confirmed it again now, the dead dropping when the glass went into the skull or throat, rather than the chest, where it produced inconsistent results. The other 2 had regular steel, and regular steel could slow but not stop, and slowing was better than nothing. And Jon used all 4 of them as a single unit with himself as the leading element, and the gap held. When Tony's pass cleared the exterior stack, Jon's arm was bleeding from a claw that had caught him through the sleeve, and 2 of his 4 people were down. Not dead, not yet, but not useful for the next 10 minutes. He looked at what was left of the eastern section. "Hold the inside edge," he told the 2 remaining. "Nobody gets through without dying first." "Including us," one of them asked. The question was genuine, not resigned, the question of a man checking the actual parameters of his orders. "Not you," Jon said. "Everything else." He went to find the next gap. The bane of the whole defense was visibility. The storm the Night King drove south was not simply cold air. It was structured building in intensity as the army advanced, thickening as the front lines pressed, reducing effective visibility across the killing ground from 100 yards at the start of the engagement to 30 yards at the end of the 2nd hour. Archers on the wall were shooting at shapes. Torches were points in gray-white, not illumination. Tony's thermal sensors were still functional, but the storm's interference was generating noise at the edges of the array, producing ghost signatures that required a second pass to confirm. He was spending roughly 15% of his operating time on confirmation passes that found nothing. 15% of operating time at this scale was a number with consequences. He recalibrated, narrowed the scan radius, prioritized, confirmed motion signatures over temperature differentials, increased the discrimination threshold for the ghost signatures. The pass efficiency went back up. He filed the adjustment and continued working the line. Tormund was on the northwest section when the palisade there finally gave way. He had been fighting for 2 hours with the particular quality of sustained violence that his body was built for, enormous, relentless. The axe-finding rhythms that outlasted the dead they were aimed at. When the palisade went, it went all at once, a whole section dropping outward under accumulated weight, and the whites poured through, and Tormund and the 8 people beside him were in the gap before the section had finished falling. They held for 6 minutes. 6 minutes was long enough for Tony to register the breach on the scan. Redirect from the south approach, where he had been thinning a flanking push, and come across the northwest section at minimum altitude, with repulsors clearing the width of the breach in a single pass. Tormund was still standing when the pass finished. 2 of the 8 were not. "Go down," Tony said from 20 feet above him. "Get off the breach. I need clear space for the next sweep." Tormund looked up at the armored figure in the snow and said something in his own language that was probably either a blessing or a profanity. "Either way, move," Tony said. Tormund moved. At the 3rd hour, Night King crossed the outer line. He had been there for some time, before anyone in the defense saw him visible in Tony's thermal array, as the negation signature moving through the dead army with a patience that existed outside the rhythm of the battle, untouched by the chaos around him. The dead parted for him without signal. The White Walkers in the rear layer turned toward him as he passed. Not as a greeting, but as plants turned toward a light source automatic orientational, the posture of things that existed in relation to a single center. He stopped at the edge of the outer killing ground and stood there and looked at Winterfell. Tony's sensors confirmed it. He altered course. He came down to 100 feet above the field and held position above Night King's location and looked at him directly for the first time. The thermal signature up close was stranger than the scan had suggested. Not cold exactly, but occupying a thermal register that flesh did not occupy the signature of something that had been alive once and had been rebuilt into something that processed the world through entirely different mechanisms. Night King looked up. Not at the sky in general. At Tony directly with the absolute certainty of something that did not need to search because it already knew. He raised one hand. The ice spear was in it before the gesture was finished, formed from nothing, or from the ambient cold, or from something that the suit's sensors had no protocol for. He threw it. Tony broke left, and the spear took a corner of the faceplate and scored across the shoulder assembly before disappearing into the dark below. The impact registered in the structural integrity display minor to moderate ablative damage faceplate, compromised on the left edge right shoulder articulation, reduced by 12%. He righted and looked down. Night King was already walking toward the castle. Jon was at the main gate when Tony landed beside him, and he read Tony's condition in the way the suit moved the slight compensation in the right shoulder, the crack visible along the faceplate's left edge, and said nothing about it. "He's inside the outer perimeter," Tony said. "I saw. The White Walkers are moving up behind him. The army will follow." He ran a scan of the courtyard, the walls, the remaining defenders. "We need everyone inside the inner wall, now." Jon looked at the outer courtyard. The people still fighting there. The positions that would be abandoned. "We leave the outer yard. We leave it, or we lose people who can't be replaced." Tony held the scan steady. "The inner wall is defensible. The outer yard is not anymore. Get everyone inside." Jon looked at the outer yard for 2 seconds. He counted without meaning to count the positions, the people, the ones who would not hear the order in time, the ones who were too deep in the fighting to extract cleanly. "Signal the retreat," he said to Tormund, who was 12 feet away and bleeding from the left shoulder. Tormund raised the horn and blew it twice, and the sound went out over the chaos of the outer yard, and people began moving, most of them. Some of them and the dead came in behind them and took the ones who moved too slowly. Jon watched and did not look away. Davos found him at the inner wall as the last defenders came through and the gate was sealed. He was an old man and looked older in the firelight and torchlight and the light of the storm. and he stood beside Jon and looked at the outer yard, filling with dead, and said, "How long?" "Until Tony reaches the Night King, and we find out if the Night King can be killed." Jon did not elaborate. There was nothing to add. Above in the storm-thickened air, a red and gold light moved across the killing ground, slower now, sweeping methodically, burning a path through the dead that refilled behind him before the next pass came. Buying time in units that could be measured in seconds and purchased in fire. Tyrion appeared at Jon's other shoulder. He had been somewhere in the inner structure. Jon had not tracked him during the battle and did not ask. He stood and looked at the outer yard and the wall, and the dead filling every visible surface, and said nothing for a long time. Then, "There are more of them than I believed possible." "Yes," Jon said. "And he is still out there." Meaning Tony. Meaning the light still moving in the storm above the yard. Yes. A crash from the north wall, not a breach, a section of walkway collapsing under accumulated weight. The soldiers on it came down into the yard, and some of them got up and some of them didn't, and the ones who didn't were not going to stay down. "If this doesn't work," Tyrion said. "It's going to work," Jon said. Tyrion looked at him. "You don't know that." "No," Jon said, "but we're doing it anyway." He picked up Longclaw and went to the north wall, and the battle continued. Outside the inner gate in the killing ground between the walls, Night King walked through his army with the unhurried certainty of something that had been waiting for this for a very long time. The dead opened ahead of him and closed behind him. The killing cold pressed south, and the temperature dropped another degree. And in the distance above the castle walls, the red and gold light banked and turned, and came back across the front of the fight one more time, tireless or refusing to stop being tireless, buying the next 2 minutes with everything it had. 2 more minutes was enough. 2 more minutes was all it ever was. At the 4th hour, the inner yard was half full of dead. Not all of them were whites. Some were soldiers who had fallen in the last hour and not yet risen, and some were whites that had been put down by Valyrian steel or dragon glass and would not rise again, and some were whites that had been put down by conventional weapons and were in the process of rising. The distinction mattered to the people still fighting. It was the only distinction that did. Jon moved through the yard with Longclaw and 2 soldiers he had picked up at the breach in the north wall 20 minutes ago and not yet lost. The inner yard was too dense for organized combat. This was knife range work, pressing through bodies, finding the ones still moving and ending them before they could end someone else. He had stopped counting at some point. Counting was no longer the relevant variable. Above, the red and gold light cut through the killing cold in long arcs. Systematic burning corridors through the pressure of dead bodies pressing in from the outer yard where the outer gate had finally given up. The arcs were slightly slower than an hour ago. Tony had been in the air for 4 hours, and whatever powered the suit was still moving, but the margin was narrowing. Jon knew what narrowing margins looked like. He took down a white that had a soldier's tabard still on it, Mormont colors, and did not stop to think about who it had been. He moved to the next one. Tony registered the 4th hour and what it meant. The data was simple. At the current rate of attrition, the inner yard would reach saturation within 30 to 40 minutes. Saturation meant the people in it would no longer have room to fight. When you ran out of room to fight, you ran out of the ability to buy the next 2 minutes. He had been buying 2 minutes at a time for 4 hours, and the supply was almost gone. He pulled altitude and looked at the full battlefield with the thermal array and the enhanced pattern recognition he had been running since hour 2. The math resolved into one conclusion. He had been fighting the symptoms since the engagement began. Every sweep, every burst, every white he dropped was a symptom. The army was a delivery mechanism for a single source. The source had been standing at the edge of the outer killing ground since hour 3, moving incrementally inward, and every time Tony had directed attention toward Night King's position, the White Walkers repositioned to obstruct the approach. 3 walkers directly ahead, 2 on each lateral, the formation shifting each time he changed vector. Not instinctive repositioning. Coordinated. Directed. He tested it. He feinted left with a wide radius approach, reading the formation response. Then broke right, and the right flank walkers adjusted exactly as far as the new threat vector required. Not more. Not less. Minimum repositioning to recover the gap. The formation was automated. Night King was running it the way a processor ran concurrent tasks, not consciously deliberating each position, just maintaining an output. Which meant the formation had a logic, and logic had exploitable gaps. He spent 90 seconds on the analysis, while the inner yard lost another 40 feet of defensible ground. The gap was on the vertical axis. The formation adjusted for lateral and low-altitude approach. It was calibrated for a threat that operated in roughly the same dimensional plane as everything else in Westeros. It had not been calibrated for something that could go straight up. He went to 2,000 feet. At 2,000 feet, the ground below resolved into a map, the inner yard. The Whites, the defenders, moving through the dark, and Night King at the base of the north wall, having moved through the breach that had opened there in the last 20 minutes. The 6-walker escort was around him, at ground level, heads tilting up in near simultaneous response to Tony's altitude change. They could not reach him at 2,000 feet. He oriented on Night King's position, aligned the descent vector, and told himself the same thing he told himself at the beginning of any high-stakes approach. The calculation was done. The window was real. The only remaining variable was execution. He came down vertical at maximum thrust. Jon saw the light go straight up and understood what it meant before he consciously processed it. He had been watching Tony operate for 6 days. He had learned to read the suit's movement the way you learn to read a familiar fighter that tells the rhythms, the specific shift that preceded a different kind of decision. Straight up meant all in. He turned to the 2 soldiers beside him. "Find Grey Worm. Tell him the north wall gap needs to hold for 5 minutes. Everything you have, everyone you can pull. 5 minutes. 5 minutes." He looked at them, once the look that settled questions. "Go." They went. He went for the north wall himself. The gap was 8 feet wide, and the Whites coming through it were stacking 2 across in the press of numbers. Grey Worm was already there, with 4 Unsullied holding the inside edge, and they were holding it. But they were not holding it easily, not anymore. Not at hour 4 of a fight that had been grinding against their capacity to continue since hour 2. Jon put himself at the right edge of the gap and worked it with Longclaw, and did not think about what was happening above him. He thought about the next thing coming through the gap and how to end it. And the thing after that, and the gap staying 8 feet wide and not becoming 10. From above, a sound unlike anything else in the engagement. Not an explosion. Something more total than an explosion, a deep structural percussion that he felt through the ground before he heard it in the air, a concussive force that arrived from directly above and radiated outward. The Whites at the gap stopped, not in the way Whites stopped when you killed them, in the way a machine stopped when the power cut. Every one of them simultaneously, at exactly the same moment, with no residual motion, not falling, not completing a half-finished lunge, just stopping. All of them. Everywhere. Jon stared at the one in the gap in front of him, Longclaw raised for a strike that was no longer needed. Silence. Not quiet. The wind still moved. Fire still crackled someone. Somewhere was still screaming from an injury that predated the last 30 seconds. But the active noise of the battle, the continuous impact and movement, and the specific sounds the dead made, was gone. all of it at once. Grey Worm's head turned slowly, taking in the yard. Every white still. Every walker that had been visible from the wall collapsed where it stood, not in pieces, not scattered, just down. The animated material of 50,000 bodies simultaneously losing whatever had been running them. The silence lasted long enough that a man on the east wall started crying. 2,000 feet was the number Tony had calculated for the descent arc. At that altitude, with maximum thrust, the kinetic energy at contact exceeded the suit's standard impact parameters by roughly 40%, which was why he had reinforced the chest assembly with a redistributed nanolayer in the final seconds before commit. He had aimed for Night King's center mass and hit it. The impact drove them both into the permafrost-hardened ground. Of the inner yard, Tony, the suit, and the entity beneath him. And the crater was 3 feet deep, and the 3-foot depth represented a significant portion of the energy transferred, which was by design. He had run the numbers. He trusted the numbers. Night King was not dead from the impact. Tony had not expected him to be. The impact was Stage 1, neutralize mobility. Break formation, create the window for Stage 2. He pushed off the crater's edge and was upright inside 2 seconds. And Night King was upright inside 3, which was what Sam's accounts had suggested: extremely fast recovery, consistent with something that processed damage differently from living tissue. The ice spear formed in Night King's hand. Tony hit him with the energy blade before he could throw it a lateral cut across the weapon arm that disrupted the throw, but did not stop the spear, which went wide and took a section of the east wall railing off at 30 yards. Night King's free hand closed on the blade itself. The energy signature registered the contact, and Tony pulled back immediately, which was the right call. He had read from the Hardhome accounts that walkers could interact with energy weapons in ways that were not straightforwardly predictable. He kept moving. That was the answer the test had given him. Don't let him close, don't let him establish grip, use the suit's speed advantage to deny the physical contact that Night King's power set required. Night King tracked him. The pale eyes followed Tony's movement with the absolute unhurried attention of something that was not threatened by speed, because it understood that speed was not the deciding variable. Another spear formed. Tony was already inside the throw distance when it completed. At close range, the throw was a problem for the same reason it had not been a problem at 200 yards. At close range, there was no arc, no trajectory to read. The spear went into his left shoulder assembly at near zero range, and the material failure was immediate articulation on the left side, dropped to 40% repulsor in the left hand, went to reduced output. He drove forward into the loss rather than away from it. The unibeam fired at contact range. At contact range, the unibeam's output was not a beam in any meaningful sense. It was a pressure event, a force applied through a single point, at a magnitude the suit had been built to produce exactly once if necessary. Tony had been calculating toward this since hour 3. Since the analysis in Sam's study. Since the farmhouse on the road north, where he had watched the dark horizon and begun working the threat profile into a solution profile. The output hit Night King in the chest. The result was not immediately visible. For approximately 1 full second, nothing appeared to change the figure in front of him, absorb the force, and Tony held ground, and the air between them was white from the energy discharge, and he could not see through the white. Then Night King's hand came up, not toward Tony, toward nothing in particular, the reflexive motion of a structure losing its organizing principle. The hand stayed up. Then it began to come apart, not explosively, not dramatically, in the way a very complex structure came apart when the single most essential component failed progressively. Each subsequent element losing coherence as the one before it, went the whole dissolution, taking perhaps 4 seconds from the first visible sign to the end. And in those 4 seconds, Tony stood at close range and watched it happen and said nothing. The last thing to go was the eyes. The Night King was not there anymore, and what had occupied his space was a shallow indentation in the frozen ground and the dispersed vapor of something that had existed for a very long time. By mechanisms that had no analog in the world Tony came from. All around him, the dead fell. John stood in the north wall gap and watched the inner yard empty of motion. Not emptied, still full of bodies, full of the physical remnants of a night's worth of combat and the detritus of whatever the dead had been before they were dead. But nothing in it was moving anymore. The whites that had been at the gap were down and would not rise. The ones in the yard were down. The ones at the south wall visible through a gap in the smoke down. Everywhere simultaneously. The way John had been told, it would work. He had believed the telling. He had built the entire night around the telling being accurate. And it had been accurate, and the yard was still. And the battle was over, and he stood at the gap with Longclaw at his side, and the blood of a dozen individual encounters drying on his armor, and did not feel the thing he had expected to feel. He felt the weight of the 4 hours, which was different. Tony landed in the center of the inner yard. The left arm was wrong. The shoulder assembly compromised the hand, hanging at an angle that indicated structural damage, rather than system failure, the kind of damage you could work around, but not ignore. The faceplate was cracked along the edge where the first ice spear had caught it 3 days ago. None of it had been repaired. John crossed the yard to him. They stood in the center of it, surrounded by the still bodies of the people they had not saved, and the dead who had finally stayed dead, and neither of them spoke immediately. "How many?" Tony said. John had a number. He did not say it. The number required context that neither of them had capacity for right now. "Too many," he said instead. Tony looked at the yard, at the walls where soldiers were beginning to understand the fight was over. And the understanding was arriving in the way. Overwhelming relief arrived not as joy, as collapse. The specific quality of bodies letting go of the tension they had been maintaining for hours, without permission to do so. Men sitting down where they stood. Brienne on one knee near the east gate, sword planted, head bowed. Tormund somewhere on the south wall, making a sound that was not recognizable as any of the usual categories of sound. "The north wall gap needs to be shored before the cold kills anyone sleeping through it," Tony said. "I know. And there's a group in the outer yard that was cut off when the outer gate—" "I know." John looked at him. "Take a minute." Tony was quiet. He looked at the crater the descent had made 3 feet deep, the edges crumbling in the cold. He looked at the dispersed vapor that had been Night King, already dispersing further in the wind. "He knew I was coming," he said, "from the moment I arrived in Westeros. Every engagement, every decision, he had already factored me in. I know. And he still lost." "Yes." Tony processed that for a moment. Then, "Because he knew what I was, but he didn't know what I'd do. He was calibrated for what he knew." He looked at John. Everything he'd ever faced before had operated within his parameters. Dragons, armies, wall. Everything that had ever tried to stop him had been trying to stop him on his terms. He didn't have a protocol for something that went around the terms entirely. John looked at him. "Is that what you did?" "That's what I always do." Outside the inner wall in the killing ground between the old defensive lines, the sound of the city resuming began quietly. Voices, movement, the cautious sounds of people confirming to themselves that it was over. A fire somewhere still burning that was contained and not spreading. A horse somewhere re-establishing its relationship with the world. Near the east gate, 3 men were standing together, liveried in the colors of 2 separate houses. Men who an hour ago had been fighting side by side, with no attention to whose flag they served. One of them said something to the others, and Tony caught the register, if not the content, the voice of a man who had been calculating survival for 4 hours and was beginning incrementally to recalculate something else. He tracked it. The man's eyes moved to the man beside him, then to the east gate, then to the empty space where the command tent had been, then back to the man beside him, with the very particular quality of a gaze that was beginning to categorize rather than simply see. Tony said nothing. Tyrion came through the inner gate shortly after dawn, moving carefully across the debris field of the yard, and stopped near the crater. He looked at the indentation, then at Tony, then at the yard in which nothing moved. "It worked," Tyrion said. Yes. He looked at the dispersed nothing that had been Night King. He looked at the bodies of the people who had not made it through the night. He looked at the walls of Winterfell, still standing, still smoking in places, and he looked at Jon and at the distance between the fact of survival and the event of it, which was larger than he had expected. "In the histories," Tyrion said quietly, "they'll write that a great battle was won here. They'll describe it in terms of strategy and sacrifice and the strength of the living. They'll list the commanders. They'll argue about credit for generations." He paused. "They won't mention what it actually cost. They never do." He looked at the 3 men near the east gate. "They've already started talking about what comes next," he said. Not an accusation, just an observation from a man who had spent his life watching the same cycle repeat. 2 of them are Lannister loyalists from Cersei's last garrison. The third is a Baratheon man from the Stormlands. They were fighting together 2 hours ago. Now they're counting, Tony said. Yes. Tony watched the 3 men. He thought about the farmhouse on the northern road. The elder who had asked what this fixed, the granaries locked, while dusk people died outside them. The 12 men inside with enough grain to feed a crowd. The farmer watching his stolen goods returned with the suspended disbelief of a man who had been robbed so many times that restitution felt like another form of vulnerability. He thought about a city built on the assumption that the people at the bottom existed to support the calculations of the people at the top, and a world that had almost ended because a different set of calculations had started at the other end of the spectrum and worked its way down. He thought about the fact that Night King was gone, and the 3 men near the east gate were still there already counting. "I know," he said. The sun was coming up over Winterfell. It was the same sun. It rose the same way it had risen for thousands of years before this morning, and would rise for thousands after, indifferent to what had happened in the dark beneath it. The light came across the broken walls, and the still yard, and the bodies of the people who had stood in the gap, and the bodies of the things that had come through it anyway, and it found them all in the same condition done. Jon Snow stood in the middle of the inner yard and looked at the light and felt it the way you felt warmth after a very long cold. Not as comfort, but as confirmation that the sun was still there, that it still rose in the east, that the category of morning had not been canceled in the night. It was enough. For now it was enough. The dead stopped moving before the sun cleared the eastern wall. For perhaps an hour after, nobody in Winterfell moved either. The survivors, those who could sit, those who could stand, those who were simply lying where they had been when the last white fell, stayed where they were and breathed and let the silence settle around them, the way silence settled after a very long noise. The fires that had been burning since midnight continued to burn. The wind came off the north and found it had nothing to drive before it anymore, and continued anyway because the wind did not know it had won. Davos Seaworth walked the inner yard at some point in that first hour. He had been a smuggler before he was a knight, and he moved with the careful cataloging attention of a man who had spent decades assessing situations for what they actually contained, rather than what they were supposed to contain. He walked past the bodies and past the soldiers and past the scorched sections of wall, and past the crater that Tony Stark had put in the frozen ground, and he emerged from the inner gate onto the outer killing ground and looked at the expanse of collapsed whites and did not say anything for a long time. Then he said to no one in particular, "Right then." He went back inside and found a fire and sat near it and waited for the world to resume. It resumed faster than he would have preferred. Chapter. By mid-morning, Tyrion had identified 7 separate conversations happening in the castle that should not have been happening yet. He moved between them the way he had always moved, in dangerous rooms, unhurried, observant, giving no indication that he was tracking anything specific. And what he found in each was a variation on the same theme. The survivors of the long night, having confirmed they were alive, had begun the process of calculating what that survival was worth and to whom. 2 Lannister commanders from Cersei's former garrison had found each other near the armory and were talking in the low, carefully modulated tones of men discussing logistics while actually discussing leverage. A lord from the Reach, who had ridden north with the last remnant of the Tyrell forces, was conferring with a man in Baratheon colors about succession to several vacant lordships, 3 of which had become vacant in the last 8 hours. A maester's apprentice was copying dispatches and copying them too slowly, which meant he was reading them, which meant someone had instructed him to read them. Tyrion went to find Tony. Tony was in the Great Hall, which was functioning as a field hospital for those who had taken injuries that were serious but survivable. He was not treating anyone. He was standing near the far wall, watching the room with the attention he brought to rooms that had something in them worth understanding. He turned when Tyrion entered. 7? Tyrion said. 11? Tony said. You missed the group near the stables and the 2 men who have been watching Jon since dawn. Tyrion absorbed this. The ones watching Jon. One of them is from a northern house that will have a succession problem if Jon is acknowledged as legitimate Targaryen heir. The other is from a house that owes significant debt to the Lannisters and has been trying to work out how that debt functions in a post-Cersei world. Tony turned back to the room. They're not a threat today. They'll be a threat inside a week if nothing changes. And the Lannister commanders. Tonight, probably. Tyrion was quiet for a moment. He looked at the injured soldiers in the hall, men and women from a dozen different houses, some of them barely old enough for the positions they had held, none of them knowing yet what they had survived into. He thought about the Reach Lord and the succession discussions and the Maester's apprentice copying dispatches. He thought about the arithmetic that always followed catastrophe, the living sorting themselves into hierarchies before the dead were cold because hierarchy was the only tool they had for managing what came next. He had spent his entire life working within that arithmetic, adjusting it at the margins, trying to make it produce less catastrophic outcomes than it was naturally inclined to produce. "What are you going to do?" he said. "What needs doing?" Tony. He looked at him. I have spent 30 years in rooms where what needed doing and what was actually done were separated by an enormous gap. I would prefer to know which side of that gap we're on tonight. Tony looked at the hall, at the people in it. He said, "The Lannister commanders are planning to move on Jon's supplies, the ones staged at Hornwood. If they control the northern supply line, they control who eats and who doesn't, which is the oldest leverage in this world. There's a man from the Reach who intends to use the confusion of the next few weeks to establish himself as regent for a child heir he has already chosen. There are 2 men who want Jon dead because a legitimate Targaryen with a reputation like his is inconvenient for their particular calculation." He paused. "And there's a keg of wildfire in the basement of the East Tower that Qyburn's network moved here 2 months ago, and that none of Cersei's former garrison has mentioned to anyone. Which means they know it's there, and are waiting to use the knowledge as a bargaining chip." Tyrion stared at him. "How do you know about the wildfire?" Thermal scan on the way in. Night before last. He turned. I've been waiting to see who mentioned it first. And nobody has. And nobody has. They stood in the field hospital in Winterfell's Great Hall. While around them, the wounded breathed and slept, and occasionally said things to each other, in the low, private tones of people who had almost died and were still processing the alternative. Outside, the wind moved over the killing ground where 50,000 dead had collapsed into inert matter and would not rise again. Tell me your terms, Tyrion said. Jon Snow did not want to be in the room for what happened next, but he was there anyway. He had found out about the wildfire an hour before Tyrion found Tony, from a young soldier who had been part of Cersei's last garrison and had come north out of something he described as duty, but which had the quality on closer examination of guilt. The soldier had told Jon about the wildfire with the careful, frightened precision of a person discharging an obligation they had been carrying for weeks and was relieved to put down. Jon had thanked him and sent him to get food and gone to find Tony. Tony was already moving. The meeting was held in the castle's council room, which had survived the battle intact by virtue of being the most heavily constructed room in Winterfell's interior, and therefore the least accessible to the siege dynamics of the outer yard. Jon sat at the table's edge. Tyrion was at the other end. Davos was there because Tyrion had brought him, and because Davos had been the person in every room for the past year who said the thing everyone was avoiding and turned out to be right about it. The 12 people who arrived under escort were the ones Tony had identified as the highest immediate risks. Not the only threats. Tyrion had been clear about that, and Tony had agreed. The only threats would take months to identify and longer to address. These 12 were the ones whose actions in the next 72 hours would determine whether the next 3 months produced something survivable or something that looked like the last 300 years. Tony did not sit. He stood at the room's only window and looked out over the yard while Tyrion spoke. Tyrion was very good at this. Jon watched him work the careful framing, the specific acknowledgments of each person's position, and the implicit statement that he understood what they were calculating, followed by the equally specific statement of what would happen if those calculations proceeded in their current direction. He did not threaten. He offered a choice and described the options with the precision of a man who had spent his life in rooms like this, and understood that the only leverage that lasted was leverage that didn't require constant reapplication. 4 of the 12 accepted the terms without significant negotiation. 3 required more specific elaboration of the consequences. 2 asked for something in exchange and received it because what they asked for was reasonable, and because reasonable exchanges were better than what happened when reasonable exchanges weren't offered. The remaining 3 were the Lannister commanders and the man from the Reach. Tony turned from the window. He did not speak to them at length. He said the supply line to Hornwood would be held by a combined force under Jon Snow's direction. The wildfire in the East Tower would be removed from Winterfell before nightfall, and anyone who had known about it and not disclosed it would be given one opportunity to explain why that had seemed like a good decision. The plan for a regent and the child heir had been noted, and the child heir was welcome to their inheritance in due course, and through whatever legitimate process applied, but not through the process currently being planned. And the 2 men who had been watching Jon since dawn would be given a different occupation for the foreseeable future. These are not negotiating positions, Tony said. These are statements of what is going to happen. I'm telling you now because knowing in advance is more dignified than finding out after. The Lannister commander on the left, a veteran, careful, the kind of man who had survived by reading situations accurately, looked at Tony for a long moment. Then he looked at Tyrion. Then he said, "And if we refuse?" Tony did not change his expression. "You'd be making an argument that the system that produced Cersei Lannister and everything that followed her should continue producing whatever comes next. You're welcome to make that argument. I'll be interested to hear it. The commander looked at him for a moment longer. Then he looked at his hands. No one refused. The East Tower's wildfire was gone by nightfall. Jon oversaw the removal personally, which was not necessary, but was the kind of thing Jon did, and the soldiers who helped him do it understood from the way he moved through the task that this was not symbolic. This was a man who had decided a thing needed doing and was doing it. Davos found Tyrion afterward on the battlements looking south. "It won't hold forever," Davos said. Not a criticism, just the observation of a man who had been around long enough to know the difference between a solution and a pause. "No," Tyrion said. "But it will hold long enough for something else to take root if we tend it carefully. Which is all any of these things ever do." He looked south for a while longer. The kingdoms have no queen, no king, no clear succession, and no great house with the power to impose one. He paused. "For the first time in recorded history, the chair is empty, and the person who could fill it is standing over there, not filling it." Davos looked at Tony, who was at the northern end of the battlements, examining the structural damage to the outer wall, with the focused attention of someone calculating repair timelines. "He's not going to fill it," Davos said. "No." "So what does that leave us?" Tyrion turned the question over. He had been turning it over since the morning, since the council room. Since the 12 people who had accepted that the current arrangement was not a negotiation. Since Westeros had woken up the morning after the end of the world and found itself standing on ground that no map it possessed was adequate to describe. "It leaves us," Tyrion said, "with the interesting problem of what a place looks like when the device that has been running it gets removed." He looked at the empty south. It might look like chaos. It might look like something different. I haven't seen it before, so I genuinely don't know. That's the most honest thing you've ever said. It's been an unusually honest few months. Tony found Jon at the north wall just before dusk. Jon was looking north the way Jon always looked when there was a north to look at, with the particular attention of a person whose entire life had been oriented toward what came from that direction, who had spent years learning to read it for threat, and who was now, for the first time in memory, reading it and finding nothing coming. "The structural damage is repairable," Tony said. 6 to 8 weeks of serious work, you'll have a functional wall again. Not what it was, but functional. I know. The supply situation is manageable if the roads reopen in the next 2 weeks. They should with the dead gone. I know. Tyrion has 3 people who can actually administer the distribution without skimming enough to matter. I know. Tony was quiet for a moment. You've thought about all of this already. I've had a long night. The sun was pulling out of the sky, the daylight going gold and then amber, and then beginning to redden at the horizon in the way that meant clear skies and hard frost, and the kind of cold that was simply cold rather than the cold that had been coming down from the north for months. The dead had taken that cold with them when they went. The remaining cold was seasonal, manageable. Jon said, "Are you leaving?" Tony looked north. Not yet. Enough things still need watching. He thought about the 3 men in the council room, the apprentice copying dispatches, the 11 other conversations Tyrion had tracked, and the ones he hadn't. But I'm not staying to run anything. I'm staying because if I leave right now, the next person who tries to reconstitute what Cersei built will believe they have a window. And when that window closes, then I'll see. He looked at Jon. The people Tyrion put in the distribution chain, Davos Sam, the 2 northern administrators, They're not a government. They're just people who can be trusted with grain. But grain is most of what government actually is when you strip off the ceremony. John turned that over. He had seen enough of the world to know it was true. He had also seen enough to know that the ceremony was what most people fought over, which made the ceremony the more dangerous variable despite being the less essential one. The Iron Throne, he said. What about it? It's still there, in King's Landing, still intact. Tony was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll deal with that when I'm south. John said nothing. He understood what that meant and what it didn't mean, and he filed it. They stood at the north wall while the sun went down, and for once, the darkening horizon was just a horizon, just the world completing its rotation as it had always completed it. Before the dead came, and before they stopped, before the queens and the iron men and the dragons, the same turning it had always been. John thought about the people underground that night in the crypts, and the root cellars, and the sheltered positions where the non-combatants had waited through the battle in the dark. He thought about the children who had heard the sounds above them, and not known what they meant, and the ones who had asked the adults and received the only honest answer, I don't know if we're going to be all right. I don't know. We'll see. They would see. That was what they had left, which was the same thing they had always had, which was what survival always reduced to the next morning. And the question of what you chose to build in it. Tony left the north wall at full dark and went to assess the east tower's foundation because the structural weakness there was real and left unaddressed would cause problems in the spring thaw, and problems that could be prevented were worth preventing. John watched him go, the suit's slight luminescence visible as it descended from the battlements and moved through the yard below, purposeful, already thinking about the next problem. Westeros had not been saved. It had been interrupted. The machine that had been producing Cerseis and Targaryens and wars without end had been hit hard enough that it would not restart immediately. And the Night King's version of ending everything was gone, and in the space between those two things, there was a gap, not a solution. A gap where something else might grow if the people in it made different choices than the people before them. Might. Not would. Might. John looked at the north wall and the clear frost-bearing sky above it, and understood that this was as good as it got, and that as good as it got was worth every hour of the night that had preceded it, and that the morning would ask its questions, regardless of how tired anyone was, and that the questions would have to be answered, because the questions always did. He went to find food. He realized, extremely hungry. The world had not ended. That was enough to start with.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to turn on notification so you won't miss our future video. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.